Recorded Books presents an unabridged recording of Aberrat by Clive Barker, narrated by Richard Ferrone.
I dreamed a limitless book, a book unbound, its leaves scattered in fantastic abundance. On every line there was a new horizon drawn, new heavens supposed, new states, new souls. One of those souls, dozing through some imagined afternoon, dreamed these words, and, needing a hand to set them down, made mine. Prologue. The Mission. From the notes of a monk of the Order of Sinoco, his name unknown. 3 is the number of those who do holy work. 2 is the number of those who do lovers' work. 1 is the number of those who do perfect evil or perfect good. The storm came up out of the southwest like a fiend stalking its prey on legs of lightning. The wind it brought with it was as foul as the devil's own breath, and it stirred up the peaceful waters of the sea. By the time the little red boat that the 3 women had chosen for their perilous voyage had emerged from the shelter of the islands and was out in the open waters, the waves were as steep as cliffs, 25-30 feet tall. "Somebody sent this storm," said Jophie, who was doing her best to steer the boat, which was called the Lyre. The sail shook like a leaf in a tempest, swinging back and forth wildly, nearly impossible to hold down. "I swear, Diamanda, this is no natural storm." Diamanda, the oldest of the 3 women, sat in the center of the tiny vessel with her dark blue robes gathered around her and their precious cargo pressed to her bosom. "Let's not get hysterical," she told Jophie and Mespa. She wiped a long piece of white hair out of her eyes. "Nobody saw us leave the Palace of Bowers. We escaped unseen, I'm certain of it." "So why this storm?" said Mespa, who was a black woman renowned for her resilience, but who now looked close to being washed away by the rain beating down on the women's heads. "Why are you so surprised that the heavens complain?" Diamanda said. "Didn't we know the world would be turned upside down by what just happened?" Jophie fought with the sail, cursing it. "Indeed, isn't this the way it should be?" Diamanda went on. "Isn't it right that the sky is torn to tatters and the sea put in a frenzy? Would we prefer it if the world didn't care?" No, of course not," said Mespa, holding on to the edge of the pitching boat, her face as white as her close-cropped hair was black. "I just wish we weren't out in the middle of it all." "Well, we are," said the old woman. "And there's not a thing any of us can do about it, so I suggest you finish emptying your stomach, Mespa." "It is empty," the sick woman said. "I have nothing left to bring up." "And you, Jophie, handle the sail." "Oh, goddesses," Jophie murmured. "Look!" "What is it?" said Diamanda. Jophie pointed up to the sky. Several stars had been shaken down from the firmament, great white cobs of fire piercing the clouds and falling seaward. One of them was heading directly toward the Lyre. "Down!" Jophie yelled, catching hold of the back of Diamanda's robes and pushing the old woman off her seat. Diamanda hated to be touched. Manhandling, she called it. She started to berate Jophie roundly for what she had done, but she was drowned out by the roaring sound of the falling star as it rushed toward the vessel. It burst the billowing sail of the Lyre, burning a hole right through the canvas, and then plunged into the sea where it was extinguished with a great hissing sound. "I swear that was meant for us," Mespa said when they had all raised their heads from the boards. She helped Diamanda to her feet. "All right," the old lady replied, yelling over the din of the seething waters. "That was closer than I would have liked." "So you think we are targets?" "I don't know, and I don't care," Diamanda said. "We just have to trust to the holiness of our mission." Mespah licked her pale lips before she chanced her next words. "Are we sure it's holy?" she said. "Perhaps what we're doing is sacrilegious. Perhaps she should be left to—" "Rest in peace," said Jofi. "Yes," Mespah replied. "She was barely more than a girl, Mespah," Jofi said. "She had a life of perfect love ahead of her, and it was stolen." "Jofi's right," said Diamanda. "Do you think a soul like hers would sleep quietly, with so much life left to live? So many dreams that she never saw come true?" Mespah nodded. "You're right, of course," she conceded. "We must do this work whatever the cost." The thunderhead that had followed them from the islands was now directly overhead. It threw down a vile, icy rain, thick as phlegm, which struck the boards of the lyre like drumming. The lightning came down around the trembling vessel on every side, its lurid light throwing the curling waves into silhouette as they rose to break over the boat. "The sail's no use to us now," said Jofi, looking up at the tattered canvas. "Then we must find other means," said Diamanda. "Mespah, take hold of our cargo for a few moments, and be careful." With great reverence, Mespah took the small box, its sides and lid decorated with the closely etched lines of talismans. Relieved of her burden, Diamanda walked down to the stern of the lyre, the pitching of the boat threatening several times to throw her over the side before she reached the safety of the little seat. There she knelt and leaned forward, plunging her arthritic hands into the icy waters. "You best be careful," Mespah warned her. "There's a 50-foot mantizak that's been following us for the last half hour. I saw it when I was throwing up." "No self-respecting fish is going to want my old bones," Diamanda said. She'd no sooner spoken than the mottled head of a mantizak, not quite the size Mespah had described, but still huge, broke the surface. Its vast maw gaped not more than a foot from Diamanda's outstretched arms. "Goddess!" the old lady yelled, withdrawing her hands and sitting up sharply. The frustrated fish pushed against the back of the boat as if to nudge one of the human morsels on board into its own element. "So," said Diamanda, "I think this calls for some moon magic." "Wait," said Jofi. "You said if we used magic, we would risk drawing attention to ourselves." "So I did," Diamanda replied. "But in our present state, we risk drowning or being eaten by that thing." The mantizak was now moving up the side of the lyre, turning up its enormous head and fixing the women with its silver and scarlet eye. Mespah clutched the little box even closer to her bosom. "It won't take me," she said, a profound terror in her voice. "No," said Diamanda reassuringly. "It won't." She raised her aged hands. Dark threads of energy moved through her veins and leaped from her fingertips, forming delicate shapes on the air, and then fled heavenward. "Lady Moon," she called, "you know we wouldn't call on you unless we needed your intervention. So we do. Lady, we three are of no consequence. We ask this boon not for ourselves, but for the soul of one who was taken from among us before she was ready to leave. Please, lady, bear us all safely through this storm so that her life may find continuance." "Name our destination," Jofi yelled over the roar of the water. "She knows our minds," Diamanda said. "Even so," Jofi replied. "Name it." Diamanda glanced back at her companion, faintly irritated. "If you insist," she said. Then, reaching toward the sky again, she said, "Take us to the hereafter." "Good," said Jofi. "Lady, hear us," Diamanda started to say, but she was interrupted by Mespah. "She heard, Diamanda." "What?" "She heard." The three women looked up. The roiling storm clouds were parting as though pressed aside by titanic hands. Through the widening slit there came a shaft of moonlight, the purest white, yet somehow warm. It illuminated the trough between the waves where the women's boat was buried. It covered the vessel from end to end with light. "Thank you, lady," Diamanda murmured. The moonlight was moving over the boat, searching out every part of the tiny vessel, even to the shadowy keel that lay beneath the water. It blessed every nail and board from prow to stern, every grommet, every oar, every pivot, every fleck of paint, every inch of rope. It touched the women, too, inspiring fresh life in their weary bones and warming their icy skin. All of this took perhaps 10 seconds. Then the clouds began to close again, cutting the moonlight off. Just as abruptly as it had begun, the blessing was over. The sea seemed doubly dark when the light had passed away, the wind keener. But the timbers of the boat had acquired a subtle luminescence from the appearance of the moon, and they were stronger for the benediction they had received. The boat no longer creaked when it was broadsided. Instead, it seemed to rise effortlessly up the steep sides of the waves. "That's better," said Diamanda. She reached out to reclaim their precious cargo. "I can take care of it," Mespa protested. "I'm sure you can," said Diamanda, "but the responsibility lies with me. I know the world we're going to, remember? You don't." "You remember the way it was," Jofi reminded her. "But it will have changed." "Very possibly," Diamanda agreed. "But I still have a better idea of what lies ahead of us than you two do. Now give me the box, Mespa." Mespa handed the treasure over, and the women's vessel carved its way through the lightless sea, picking up speed as it went, the bow lifting a little way above the waters. The rain continued to beat down on the women's heads, gathering in the bottom of the boat until it was 4 inches deep. But the voyagers took no notice of its assault. They simply sat together in grateful silence as the magic of the moon hurried them toward their destination. "There!" said Jofi. She pointed off toward the distant shore. "I see the hereafter." "I see it too," said Mespa. "Oh, thank the goddess! I see it! I see it!" "Hush yourselves," Diamanda said. "We don't want to draw attention." "It looks empty," Jofi said, scanning the landscape ahead. "You said there was a town." "There is a town, but it's a little distance from the harbor." "I see no harbor." "Well, there's not much of it left," Diamanda said. "It was burned down long before my time." The keel of the Lyre was grating on the shore of the hereafter. Jofi was first out, hauling on the rope and securing it to a piece of aged timber that was driven into the ground. Mespa helped Diamanda out, and the three of them stood side by side, assessing the unpromising landscape spread before them. The storm had followed them across the divide between the two worlds, its fury undimmed. "Now, let's remember," said Diamanda. "We're here to do one thing and one thing only. We get our business done and then we leave. Remember, we should not be here." "We know that," said Mespa. "But let's not be hasty and make a mistake," Jofi said, glancing at the box Diamanda carried. "For her sake, we have to do this right. We carry the hopes of the Aberrat with us." Even Diamanda was quieted by this remark. She seemed to meditate on it for a long moment, her head downturned, the rain washing her white hair into curtains that framed the box she held. Then she said, "Are you both ready?" The other women murmured that yes, they were, and with Diamanda leading the way, they left the shore and headed through the rain-lashed grass to find the place where Providence had arranged they would do their holy work. Part 1. Morningtide. From the last poem written by Righteous Bandy, the nomad poet of Aberrat. Life is short and pleasures few, and hold the ship and drown the crew. But oh, how very blue the sea is. Chapter 1. Room 19. The project Miss Schwartz had set for Candy's class was simple enough. Everyone had a week to bring into school 10 interesting facts about the town in which they all lived. Something about the history of Chickentown would be fine, she said, or, if students preferred, facts about the way the town was today, which meant, of course, the same old stuff about chicken farming in modern Minnesota. Candy had done her best. She'd visited the school library and scoured its shelves for something, anything, about the town that to her sounded vaguely interesting. There was nothing. Nada. Zero. Zip. There was a library on Norton Street that was 10 times the size of the school library, so she went there. Again she scanned the shelves. There were a few books about Minnesota that mentioned the town, but the same boring facts were repeated in volume after volume. Chickentown had a population of 36,793, and it was the biggest producer of chicken meat in the state. One of the books, having mentioned the chickens, described the town as otherwise undistinguished. Perfect, Candy thought. I live in a town that is otherwise undistinguished. Well, that was fact number 1. She needed only 9 more. We live in the most boring town in the country, she complained to her mother, Melissa, when she returned home. I can't find anything worth writing about for Miss Schwartz. Melissa Quackenbush was in the kitchen making meatloaf. The kitchen door was closed so as not to disturb Candy's father, Bill. He was in a beer-induced slumber in front of the television, and Candy's mother wanted to keep it that way. The longer he stayed unconscious, the easier it was for everyone in the house, including Candy's brothers Don and Ricky, to get on with their lives. Nobody ever mentioned this aloud. It was a silent understanding between the members of the household. Life was more pleasant for everyone when Bill Quackenbush was asleep. "Why do you say it's boring?" Melissa asked as she seasoned the meatloaf. "Just take a look out there," Candy said. Melissa didn't bother, but that was only because she knew the scene outside the window all too well. Beyond the grimy glass was the family's chaotic backyard, the shin-high grass browned by the heat wave that had come unexpectedly in the middle of May, the inflatable pool they'd bought the previous summer and had never deflated and stowed away, now a dirty circle of red and white plastic at the far end of the yard. Beyond the collapsed pool was the broken fence, and beyond the fence, another yard in not much better shape, and another, until eventually the yards ended, and the streets too, and the empty grasslands began. "I know what you want for your project," she said. "Oh," said Candy, going to the fridge and taking out a soda. "What do I want?" "You want something weird," Melissa said, putting the meat into the baking tin and thumbing it down. "You've got a little morbid streak in you, just like your Grandma Frances. She used to go to the funerals of complete strangers." "She did not," Candy said with a laugh. "She did, I swear. She loved anything like that. You get it from her. You certainly don't get it from me or your dad." "Oh, well, that really makes me feel welcome." "You know what I mean," Candy's mother protested. "So you don't think Chickentown is boring?" Candy said. "There are worse places, believe me," Melissa said. "At least it's got a bit of history." "Not much of one. Not according to the books I looked at," Candy said. "You know who you should talk to?" Melissa said. "Who?" "Norma Lipnick. You remember Norma? She and I used to work at the Comfort Tree Hotel together." "Vaguely," Candy said. "All kinds of strange things happen at hotels, and the Comfort Tree has been around since, oh, I don't know. You ask Norma, she'll tell you." "Is she the one with the white blonde hair who always wore too much lipstick?" Melissa looked up at her daughter with a little smile. "Don't you go saying anything rude to her now." "I wouldn't do a thing like that." "I know how these things slip out of you." "Mom, I'll be really polite." "Good, you do that." She's the assistant manager there now, so if you're real nice to her and you ask the right questions, I bet you she'll give you something for your project that nobody else in class will have. Like what? You go over there and ask her. She'll remember you. Ask her to tell you about Henry Murkett. Who's Henry Murkett? You go and ask her. It's your project. You should get out there and do some legwork, like a detective. Is there much to detect? Candy said. You'd be surprised. She was. The first surprise was Norma Lipnick herself, who was no longer the tacky woman that Candy remembered, her hair teased high and her dress too short. In the 8 years or so since Candy had seen Norma, she had let her hair go naturally gray. The bright red lipstick was a thing of the past, as were the short dresses. But once Candy had introduced herself, Norma's new professional reserve was soon cast to the winds, and the warm, gossipy woman Candy remembered emerged. "Lord, how you've grown, Candy," she said. "I never see you around, you or your mother. Is she doing okay?" "Yeah, I guess. I heard your dad lost his job at the chicken factory, had a little problem with the beer, so I was told." Candy didn't have time to agree or deny this. "You know what? I think that sometimes people should be given second chances. If you don't give people second chances, how are they ever going to change?" "I don't know," Candy said, feeling uncomfortable. "Men," Norma said. "You stay away from them, darling. They are more trouble than they're worth. I'm on my 3rd marriage, and I don't give that more than 2 months. "Oh? Anyway, you didn't come over here to listen to me chattering on, so how can I help you?" "I've got this project to do about Chickentown," Candy explained. "It was set by Miss Schwartz, who always gives us these projects that are only fit for 6th graders. Besides, she doesn't like me very much." "Oh, don't let her get you down, honey. There's always one who makes your life hell. You'll be out of school soon enough. What are you going to do then? Work over at the factory?" Candy felt a great weight settle on her shoulders, imagining that horrendous prospect. "I hope not," she said. "I want to do something more with my life." "But you don't know what?" Candy shook her head. "Don't worry, it'll come to you," Norma said. "I hope it does, because you don't want to get stuck here." "No, I don't. I really don't." "So you've got a project about Chickentown?" "Yes, and Mom said there were some things that went on in the hotel I should find out about. She said you'd know what she was talking about." "Did she indeed?" said Norma with a teasing little smile. "She said to ask you about Henry Murkett. Yes, Henry Murkett." "Poor old Henry. What else did she say? Did she tell you about room 19? "No, she didn't mention anything about a room. She just gave me the name." "Well, I can tell you the tale," Norma said. "But I don't know if Murkett's story is the kind of thing your Miss Schwartz will be looking for." "Why not?" "Well, because it's rather dark," Norma said. "Tragic, in fact." Candy smiled. "Well, Mom says I'm morbid, so I'll probably like it." "Morbid, huh? All right," said Norma. "I guess I should tell you the whole darn thing. You see, Chickentown used to be called Murkett." "Really? That wasn't in any of the books about Minnesota." "You know how it is. There's the history that finds its way into the books, and there's the history that doesn't." "And Henry Murkett is part of the history that doesn't." "Huh." Candy was fascinated. Remembering what her mother had said about doing some detective work, she took out her notebook and began to write in it. Murkett. History we don't know. "So the town was named after Henry Murkett?" "No," said Norma. "It was named after his grandfather, Wallace Murkett." "Why did they change it?" "I guess Chickentown fits, doesn't it? This place has got more damn chickens in it than it has people, and sometimes I think folks care more about the chickens than they do about each other. My husband works over at the factory, so that's all I ever hear from him and his friends. Chicken talk? Chickens, chickens, and more darn chickens." Norma glanced at her watch. "You know, I don't have much time to show you room 19 today. I've got a big party of folks coming in. Can we do this another day?" "I've got to have the report in by tomorrow morning." "You kids always leaving things to the last minute," Norma said. "Well, okay. We'll do this quickly, but you be sure to jot it all down because I won't have time to say anything twice." "I'm ready," said Candy. Norma took her passkey from her pocket. "Linda," she said to the woman working at the front desk, "I'm just going up to room 19. The woman frowned. "Really? What for?" The question went unanswered. "I won't be more than 10 minutes, Norma said. She led Candy away from the reception area, talking as she went. "This is the new part of the hotel we're in right now," she explained. "It was built in 1964, but once we step through here," she led Candy through a pair of double doors, "we're in the old hotel. It used to be called the High Seas Hotel. Don't ask me why." Even if Candy hadn't been told that there was a difference between the portion of the hotel she had been in and the part that Norma had brought her into, she would have known it. The passageways were narrower here and less well lit. There was a sour smell of age in the air, as if somebody had left the gas on. "We only put people up in the old part of the hotel if all the other rooms are full, and that only happens when there's a chicken buyers' conference. Even then, we try never to put people in room 19. "Why's that?" "Well, it's not that it's haunted, exactly, though there have been stories. Personally, I think all that stuff about the afterlife is nonsense. You get one life, and you'd better make the best of it. My sister got religion last year, and she's shaping up for a sainthood, I swear." Norma had led Candy to the end of a passageway where there was a narrow staircase illuminated by a single lamp. It cast a yellowish light that did nothing to flatter the charmless wallpaper and the cracking paintwork. Candy almost remarked that it was no wonder the management kept this part of the hotel out of the sight of guests, but she bit her tongue, remembering what her mother had said about keeping less courteous thoughts to herself. Up the creaking stairs they went. They were steep. "I should stop smoking," Norma remarked. "It'll be the death of me." There were 2 doors at the top. One was room 17, the other was room 19. Norma handed the pass key to Candy. "You want to open it?" Norma said. "Sure." Candy took the key and put it in the lock. "You have to jiggle it around a little." Candy jiggled, and after a little work the key turned, and Candy opened the ill-oiled door of room 19. Chapter 2. What Henry Murkett Left Behind. It was dark inside the room, the air still and stale. "Why don't you go ahead and open the drapes, honey?" Norma said, taking the key back from Candy. Candy waited a moment for her eyes to become accustomed to the gloom, then she tentatively made her way across the room to the window. The thick fabric of the drapes felt greasy against her palms, as though they hadn't been cleaned in a very long time. She pulled. The drapes moved reluctantly along dust and dirt-clogged rails. The glass Candy found herself looking through was as filthy as the fabric. "How long is it since anybody rented the room?" Candy said. "Actually, I can't remember if there's been anybody in it since I've been at the hotel," Norma said. Candy looked out of the window. The view was no more inspiring to the senses or the soul than the view out of the kitchen window of 34 Followell Street, her home. Immediately below the window was a small courtyard at the back of the hotel, which contained 5 or 6 garbage cans filled to overbrimming, and the skeletal remains of last year's Christmas tree still wearing its shabby display of tinsel and artificial snow. Beyond the yard was Lincoln Street, or so Candy guessed. The journey through the hotel had completely disoriented her. She could see the tops of cars above the wall of the yard, and a discount drugstore on the opposite side of the street, its doors chained and padlocked, its shelves bare. "So," said Norma, calling Candy's attention back into room 19, "this is where Henry Murkett stayed." "Did he come to the hotel often?" "To my knowledge," Norma said, "he came only once. But I'm not really sure about that, so don't quote me." Candy could understand why Henry wouldn't have been a repeat visitor. The room was tiny. There was a narrow bed against the far wall, and a chair in the corner with a small black television perched on it. In front of it was a second chair on which was perched an overfilled ashtray. "Some of our employees come up here when they have half an hour to spare to catch up on the soap operas," Norma said by way of explanation. "So they don't believe the room's haunted?" "Put it this way, honey," Norma said. "Whatever they believe, it doesn't put them off coming up here." "What's through there?" Candy said, pointing to a door. "Look for yourself," Norma said. Candy opened the door and stepped into a minuscule bathroom that hadn't been cleaned in a very long time. In the mirror above the filthy sink, she met her own reflection. Her eyes looked almost black in the murk of this little cell, and her dark hair needed a cut. But she liked her own face, even in such an unpromising light. She had her mother's smile, open and easy, and her father's frown, the deep, troubled frown that Bill Quackenbush wore in his beer dreams, and, of course, her odd eyes, the left dark brown, the right blue, though the mirror reversed them. "When you've quite finished admiring yourself," Norma said. Candy closed the bathroom door and went back to her note-taking to cover her embarrassment. "There is no wallpaper on the walls of room 19, she wrote, just plaster painted a dirty white. One of the 4 walls had a curious abstract pattern on it which was faintly pink. All in all, she couldn't have imagined a grimmer or more uncomfortable place. "So what can you tell me about Henry Murkett?" she asked Norma. "Not that much," the woman replied. "His grandfather was the founding father of the town. In fact, we're all of us here because Wallace Murkett decided he'd had enough of life on the trail. The story goes that his horse upped and died on him in the middle of the night, so they had no choice but to settle down right here in the middle of nowhere." Candy smiled. There was something about this little detail which absolutely fit with all she knew about her hometown. "So Chickentown exists because Wallace Murkett's horse died?" she said. Norma seemed to get the bitter joke. "Yeah," she said. "I guess that about sums things up, doesn't it? But apparently Henry Murkett was very proud of having his family's name on the town. It was something he used to boast about. Then they changed it." "Yes, well, I'll get to that in a moment. Really, poor Henry's life was a series of calamities toward the end. First his wife, Diamanda, left him. Nobody knows where she went. And then sometime in December 1947, the town council decided to change the name of the town. Henry took it very badly. On Christmas Eve he checked into the hotel, and the poor man never checked out again." Candy had guessed something like this was coming, but even so it made the little hairs on the nape of her neck prickle to hear Norma say it. "He died in this room?" Candy said softly. "Yes." "How? A heart attack?" Norma shook her head. "Oh, no," said Candy, beginning to put the pieces together. "He killed himself?" "Yes, I'm afraid so." The room suddenly felt a little smaller, if that were possible, the corners, despite the sun that found its way through the dirtied glass, a little darker. "That's horrible," Candy said. "You'll learn, honey," Norma said. "Love can be the best thing in life, and it can be the worst, the absolute worst." Candy kept her silence. For the first time she saw how sad Norma's face had become in the years since they'd last met, how the corners of her mouth were drawn down and her brow deeply etched with lines. "But it wasn't just love that broke Henry Murkett's heart," Norma said. "It was—" "The fact they changed the name of the town?" Candy said. "Yes, that's right. After all, it was his family name, his claim to a little bit of immortality, if you like. When that was gone, I guess he didn't think he had anything left to live for." "Poor man," Candy said, echoing Norma's earlier sentiments. "Did he leave a note? I mean a suicide note?" "Yes, of a kind. As far as I can gather, he said something about waiting for his ship to come in." "What did he mean by that?" Candy said, jotting the phrase down. "Well, he was probably drunk and a little crazy, but he had something in the back of his head about ships and the sea." "That's strange," Candy said. "It gets stranger," Norma said. She went to the small table beside the bed and opened the drawer. In it was a copy of Gideon's Bible and a strange object made of what looked like brass. She took it out. "According to the stories," she said, "this is the only object of any worth he had with him." "What is it?" Norma handed it to Candy. It was heavy and etched with numbers. There was a moving part that was designed to line up with the numbers. "It's a sextant," Norma said. Candy looked blank. "What's a sextant?" "It's something sailors use to find out where they are when they're out at sea. I don't know exactly how it works, but you line it up with the stars somehow, and—" She shrugged. "You find out where you are." "And he had this with him?" "As I say, according to the stories. This very one." "Wouldn't the police have taken it?" Candy said. "You would think so, but as long as I've been working in the hotel, that thing has been here in that drawer beside the Gideon's Bible. Henry Murcutt sextant." "Huh," said Candy, not at all sure what to make of any of this now. She handed the object back to Norma, who carefully, even a little reverently, returned it to its place and slid the drawer closed. "So that and the note were all he left?" Candy asked. "No," said Norma. "He left something else." "What?" "Look around you," Norma replied. Candy looked. What was there here that could have belonged to Henry Murcutt? The furniture? Surely not. The age-worn rug under her feet? Perhaps, but it was unlikely. The lamp? No. What did that leave? There weren't any pictures on the wall, so— "Oh, wait a minute," she said, looking at the stains on the wall. "Not those." Norma just looked at her, raising a perfectly plucked eyebrow. "Those?" Candy said. "No matter how many coats of paint the workmen put on that wall, the stains show through." Candy went closer to the wall, examining the marks. A part of her, the part that her morbid grandmother could take credit for, wanted to ask Norma the obvious question. How had the stains got up there? Had he shot himself or used a razor? But there was another part that preferred not to know. "Horrible," she said. "That's what happens when people realize their lives aren't what they dreamed they'd be," Norma said. She glanced at her watch. "Oh, Lord, look at the time. I've got to get going. That's the story of Henry Murcutt." "What a sad man," Candy said. "Well, I guess all of us are waiting for our ships to come in one way or another," Norma said, going to the door and letting Candy out onto the gloomy landing. "Some of us still live in hope," she said with a half-hearted smile. "But you have to, don't you?" And with that she closed the door on the room where Henry Murcutt had breathed his last. Chapter 3. Doodle. Miss Schwartz, Candy's history teacher, was not in a pleasant mood at the best of times, but today her mood was fouler than usual. As she went around the classroom, returning the project papers on Chickentown, only her few favorite students, who were usually boys, earned anything close to good marks. Everyone else was being criticized. But nothing the rest of the class had faced compared with Miss Schwartz's attack on Candy's paper. "Facts, Candy Quackenbush," the woman said, tossing Candy's paper about Henry Murcutt's demise down on her desk. "I asked for facts, and what do you give me?" "Those are facts, Miss—" "Don't answer back," Miss Schwartz snapped. "These are not facts. They are morbid pieces of gossip, nothing more. This work, like most of your work, is worthless." "But I was in that room in the Comfort Tree Hotel," she said. "I saw Henry Murcutt's sextant." "Are you hopelessly gullible?" said Schwartz. "Or are you just plain stupid? Every hotel has some kind of ridiculous ghost story. Can't you tell the difference between fact and fiction?" "But, Miss Schwartz, I swear these are facts." "You get an F, Candy." "That's not fair," Candy protested. Miss Schwartz's upper lip began to twitch, a sure sign that she was going to start yelling soon. "Don't talk back to me," she said, her volume rising. "If you don't stop indulging in these dim-witted fantasies of yours and start doing some real work, you're going to fail this class completely, and I'll personally see you held back a year for your laziness and your insolence." There was a lot of tittering from the back of the class where the coven of Candy's enemies, led by Deborah Hackbarth, all sat. Miss Schwartz threw them a silencing look, which worked, but Candy knew they were smiling behind their hands, passing notes back and forth about Candy's humiliation. "Why can't you be normal?" Miss Schwartz said. "Give me work like this from Ruth Ferris." She leafed through the pages. Miss Schwartz held up the papers so that everybody could see what an exemplary piece of work Ruth had done. "You see these graphs?" Miss Schwartz was flicking through the pages of colored graphs Ruth had thoughtfully provided as appendices to her paper. "You know what they're about?" "Well, do you, Candy?" "Let me guess," said Candy. "Chickens?" "Yes, chickens. Ruth wrote about the #1 industry in our community. Chickens." "Maybe that's because her father is the factory manager," Candy said, throwing the perfect Miss R. Ferris a sour look. She knew, everybody knew, including Miss Schwartz, that Ruth's pretty little charts and flow diagrams, from egg to chicken nugget, had been copied out of her father's glossy brochures for Applebaum's Farms. "Who cares about chickens?" Candy said. "Chickens are the lifeblood of this town, Candy Quackenbush. Without chickens, your father wouldn't have a job." "He doesn't have a job, Miss Schwartz," said Deborah. "Oh, well, he likes his beer too much." "All right, that's enough, Deborah," said Miss Schwartz, sensing that things were getting out of hand. "You see how disruptive you are, Candy." "What did I do?" Candy protested. "We waste far too much time on you in class, far too much—" She stopped speaking because her eyes had alighted on Candy's workbook. She snatched it up off the desk. For some reason, Candy had started drawing wavy patterns on the cover of her book a couple of days before, her hand simply making the marks without her mind consciously instructing it to do so. "What is this?" Miss Schwartz demanded, flipping through the pages of the workbook. The interior was decorated in the same way as the cover, tightly set lines, hundreds of them, waving up and down all over the page. "It's bad enough you bring these morbid stories of yours into school," Miss Schwartz was saying. "Now you're defacing school property?" "It's just a doodle," Candy said. "Good Lord, are you going crazy? There are pages and pages of this rubbish." Miss Schwartz held the workbook at arm's length as though it might infect her. "What do you think you're doing? What are these?" For some reason, as Miss Schwartz stared down at her, Candy thought of Henry Murkett sitting in room 19 on that distant Christmas Eve, waiting for his ship to come in. Thinking of him, she realized what she'd been drawing so obsessively in her workbook. "It's the sea," she said quietly. "It's what?" said Miss Schwartz, her voice oozing contempt. "It's the sea. I was drawing the sea." "Were you indeed? Well, it may look like the sea to you, but it looks like 2 weeks in detention to me." There was a little eruption of laughter from the back of the class. This time Miss Schwartz didn't hush it. She simply tossed the defaced workbook onto Candy's desk. It was a bad throw. Instead of landing neatly in front of the disgraced Candy, it skimmed across the desk, taking the paper about Henry Murkett, along with several pens, pencils, and a blue plastic ruler, off the other side and onto the floor. The laughter halted. There was a hush while one of the pens rolled to a halt. Then Miss Schwartz said, "I want you to pick all that trash up." Candy didn't reply, at least not at first. She remained in her seat, not moving a muscle. "Did you hear me, Candy Quackenbush?" The Hackbarth clique was in hog heaven. They watched with smirks on their faces as Candy sat in her seat, still refusing to move. "Candy?" Miss Schwartz. "I heard you, Miss Schwartz." "Then pick them up." "I didn't knock them off the desk, Miss Schwartz." "I beg your pardon?" "I said I didn't knock them off the desk. You did, so I think you should pick them up." All the blood had drained from Miss Schwartz's face. The only color that remained was the purple of the shadows under her eyes. "Get up," she said. "Miss Schwartz?" "You heard me. I said get up. I want you down at the principal's office right now." Candy's heart was beating furiously, and her hands were clammy. But she wasn't going to let Miss Schwartz or any of her enemies in class see that she was nervous. She was irritated with herself for letting Miss Schwartz escalate this stupid showdown. Maybe the principal would be more sympathetic to Candy's researches than Miss Schwartz, but Candy doubted that she'd even get to show him her paper. All Miss Schwartz would want to talk about was Candy's insolence. Unfortunately, it was a subject the principal took very seriously. Only a month ago he had talked to the whole school about that very subject. There would be a policy of zero tolerance, he told everyone, toward pupils who were disrespectful to teachers. Any student who crossed the line, he'd said, between civility and rudeness of any kind could expect serious consequences. He had meant what he said. 2 weeks ago, he had expelled 2 students for what he had called extreme discourtesy toward a teacher. Candy half wondered if there was still time to apologize, but she knew it was a lost cause. Miss Schwartz wanted to see Candy squirming in front of the principal, and she wasn't going to let anything keep her from witnessing that. "You're still sitting down, Quackenbush," the woman said. "What did I tell you?" "Well?" "Go to the principal's office, Miss Schwartz." "So move your lazy behind." Candy bit her tongue and got up. Her chair made an ugly squeal as she pushed it back. There was more nervous laughter from 1 or 2 places around the class, but mostly there was silence, even from the loquacious Deborah Hackbarth. Nobody wanted to draw Miss Schwartz's venomous attention in their direction right now. "And pick up your workbook, Quackenbush," Miss Schwartz said. "I want you to explain your defacing of school property to the principal." Candy didn't argue. She dutifully went down on her haunches and gathered up all the things that Miss Schwartz had knocked off her desk: the pencils, the pens, the workbook, and the paper on Henry Murkett. "Give that stupid paper and the workbook to me," Miss Schwartz said. "I'm not going to destroy them," Candy protested. "Just give them to me," Miss Schwartz demanded, her voice almost cracking with rage. Candy put the pens and pencils down on her desk and gave the book and paper to Miss Schwartz. Then, without looking around at the rest of the class, she made her way to the door. Once she was outside the classroom in the eerie hush of the corridor, she felt a peculiar sense of relief. She knew she should be feeling full of regret and self-recrimination, but the truth was that a significant part of her was glad she'd said what she'd said. Miss Schwartz had picked on her 1 too many times. She was a ridiculous woman anyway, with her endless snide remarks and her ludicrous obsession with chickens. "Who cares about chickens?" Candy said, her voice echoing down the empty passageway. The door at the end of the corridor was open. Through it, she could see the sunlit yard, and beyond the yard, the school gate and the street. It would be so easy, she thought, just to walk out of here right now and never have to hear Miss Schwartz pontificate on the glories of chicken farming ever again. What was she thinking? She couldn't do that. She'd be expelled for certain. "So what?" said a voice at the back of her head. "Just walk out. Go on. Walk out." For some reason, the doodles that she had drawn in her workbook came back into her mind. Only this time, instead of being black lines on gray recycled paper, they were bright in her mind, very bright. And all kinds of colors, the way the sun appeared in your mind if you looked at it for a moment and then closed your eyes. Dozens of little suns, green and red and gold, then colors, too, that you couldn't even name. That was the way the lines looked in Candy's mind's eye. And they were moving. The wavy lines were rolling across the darkness inside her skull, rolling and breaking, the brilliant colors bursting into arabesques of white and silver. Behind her, she heard a familiar sound, the click-click-click of Miss Schwartz's heels. "What are you still doing in the corridor, Candy Quackenbush?" she yelled down the corridor. "I told you to report to the principal's office." Everyone in the classes along the passage had heard the woman Candy knew. Tomorrow she'd be the butt of every idiotic joke. Candy glanced over her shoulder. Miss Schwartz was gaining on her, her arms crossed in front of her bosom. Held captive behind them was the evidence for the prosecution, Candy's workbook and the paper on Henry Murkett. Poor Henry Murkett, sitting in that cold little room in the hotel, waiting with his sextant for a ship to come and find him, checking the stars, consulting his watch, waiting and waiting until he could stand the wait no longer. Candy looked away from Miss Schwartz, her gaze returning to the rectangle of brightness at the end of the corridor, and still the lines rolled on in her mind's eye, rolled and broke, rolled and broke. "Where do you think you're going?" Miss Schwartz demanded. Candy's feet knew, even if her brain was a little slow at catching up with the idea. They were taking her out of here. "You head right back to the principal's office," Miss Schwartz called after her. Candy didn't really hear the woman's words very clearly now. The lines in her head were making a sound like the din of white noise on an untuned television. It washed away Miss Schwartz's demands. "Candy Quackenbush, come back here!" Her shrill voice was being heard from one end of the school to the other, but the person to whom they were directed was deaf to them. Out she went, with Miss Schwartz pursuing her, inventing new threats and demands to throw in Candy's direction. Candy took no notice of them. She stepped over the threshold and out into the bright morning. A little portion of her mind still said, "Candy, turn around. What are you doing? They'll expel you for certain." But the voice was too small to convince her feet. At the threshold, she broke into a run. It took her 30 seconds to reach the school gate and get out into the street. A few students caught sight of her as she made her departure. Those who knew her said they'd never seen Candy Quackenbush looking happier. Chapter 4. Street Ends. The bright rolling doodle stayed in Candy's mind's eye, even though her feet had obeyed its instruction and carried her out through the school gates and into the street. She briefly thought about going home, but the notion didn't stay in her head for long. She had no desire to be back in Folwell Street. Though her mom would be at work, her father would be up and about by now, and he'd want to know why she had returned from school in the middle of the morning. So she walked in the opposite direction, down Spaulding Street to the intersection with Lenox, over Lenox and on toward the Comfort Tree Hotel on Stillman Street. She had half a thought to call in at the hotel and tell Norma Lipnick exactly what had happened when she'd tried to tell the sad story of Henry Murkett. Perhaps she could even persuade Norma to lend her the passkey so that she could go back up to room 19 and look at the sextant again. Hold it in her hands and examine it, see if she got a clearer picture of poor Henry's last hours when she did so. But once she got to the hotel, she found the desire to see the sextant was not as important as another desire, one which she couldn't name or comprehend, but which kept her going on past the hotel to the intersection of Stillman and Lincoln. Here, for a moment, she stopped. The streets were busy in both directions, at least busy for Chickentown. There were 4 or 5 cars waiting at the lights every time they turned red. One of the drivers was Frank Wrightson, who had been a drinking buddy of her father's until 6 months before, when they had had a big falling out. It had ended in a shouting match outside the house and a few blows half-heartedly exchanged. The men hadn't spoken to each other since. "Hey, Candy!" Frank yelled as he drove by. She waved, trying not to look too guilty for being out in the street in the middle of a Thursday morning. "No school today?" Frank yelled. Candy was just trying to figure out a way to answer this without lying to Frank Wrightson when the woman in the car behind his truck honked her horn to hurry him on his way. Returning Candy's wave, he drove off. Which way now? She thought. She couldn't wait at the intersection forever. And then the decision was made for her. A gust of wind came down Stillman Street from the direction of the chicken factory. It stank of chicken excrement and worse. I'm not going to take Stillman Street, she thought to herself. So that left Lincoln. Without another thought, she turned the corner, and as soon as she'd done so, she knew that was the decision she was supposed to make. Not only did the foul smell disappear almost completely, but there, at the far end of the street, where Lincoln ran out of houses and gave way to the prairie, was a cloud, vast and shaped like some enormous flower, blossoming as the wind carried it south, away from town. For some reason, the sight of it, its golden color, its shape, its sheer size, put everything she'd left behind, Miss Schwartz and her stupidities, Deborah Hackbarth and the rest, even the smell on Stillman Street, out of her head. Smiling as she walked, she headed on past the hotel and on down Lincoln Street toward the cloud. The wavy lines in her head began to fade now, as though they had done their job by getting her out wandering until she came in sight of this blossom cloud. She'd seen it. She had her destination. The houses were thinning out now as she approached the end of Lincoln Street. She could remember venturing so far in this direction only once before, and that was because Patty Gibson, who'd been her best friend 3 years ago, had brought her down here to show her one of the few memorable front lawns in Chickentown. It had belonged to an old woman by the name of Lavinia White, known to all as the Widow White. In place of flowers, Lavinia had planted plastic pinwheels in the grass, the kind constructed of brightly colored plastic that made a whirring sound when the wind spun them. No doubt the Widow White was a little bit crazy, because she hadn't simply put 3 or 4 of these things in her garden. She'd planted hundreds in place of ordinary flowers. Some bright scarlet, some eye-pricking green, some striped or spiraled. It had been quite a sight, Candy remembered. To her astonishment, she found that they were still there. She heard them before she saw them, the massed noise of their whirring coming to meet her down Lincoln Street. When she came in sight of them, she found that they were all rather the worse for wear. Clearly the Widow White hadn't replaced the pinwheels with new ones over the last few seasons, and many had been knocked over by the wind or had lost their plastic blooms, and she'd simply left the sticks in the dirt. But perhaps 1 in 3 of them remained operational, and that still provided a bizarre spectacle. Candy glanced up at the house itself as she passed, and there in the upper window, sitting in a wheelchair watching the world go by, or as much of the world as would pass by the last house in the street before the grasslands began, was old Widow White herself. She had her eyes on Candy, so Candy gave her a wave and a smile. The Widow White returned neither. There was no barricade or fence at the end of the street, just a sign placed at the limit of the asphalt that stated, with absurd redundancy, "Street Ends." "Oh, really?" said Candy, looking up at the sign. Beyond it, there was just rolling prairie and the cloud. It had grown in size in the time that Candy had taken to walk the length of Lincoln Street, and it was no longer moving away from town. The wind had changed direction and now seemed to be coming from the north. It had a curious tang to it, which was not the smell of the factory and its clotted drains. She didn't know what it was. She glanced back over her shoulder down the length of Lincoln Street. From here, it was a half-hour walk home at least. If the great gilded cloud was bringing rain, then she was going to get wet on her way back to Followill Street. But she had no desire to start the homeward trek, not for a little while at least. She had no idea of what lay ahead of her besides the wild hills and the long grass, and the orange milkweed, the larkspur, and prairie lilies in among the grass. But walking for a while where nobody except the Widow White knew she'd gone was better than going home to listen to her father in the first stages of the day's drinking, raging on about the injustices of his life. Without another thought, she walked on past the Street Ends sign, catching it with her palm as she went so that it rocked in the shallow hole some lazy workman had made for it, and headed out into the gently swaying grass. Butterflies and bees wove ahead of her as if they were showing her the way. She followed them happily. When next she looked back, the shoulder-high grass had almost obscured Chickentown from sight. She didn't care. She had a good sense of direction. When the time came for her to find her way back, she'd be able to do just that. Her eyes glued to the great swelling mass of the cloud, she walked on, her griefs and humiliations left somewhere behind her, where the road ended and the ocean of grass and flowers began. Chapter 5. A Shore Without a Sea. After perhaps 10 minutes of walking, Candy glanced back over her shoulder to see that the gentle swells and gullies she'd crossed to get to her present position had put Chickentown out of sight completely. Even the spire on the church on Hawthorne Street and the 5 stories of the town hall had vanished. She took a moment and turned on the spot 360 degrees. In every direction, the landscape presented the same unremarkable vista of wind-blown grass, with 2 exceptions. Some way off to her right lay a small copse of trees, and nearly dead ahead of her was a much more curious sight. A kind of skeletal tower set in the middle of this wilderness of grass and flowers. What was it? Some kind of watchtower? If it had been a watchtower, then those who'd occupied it must have been very bored with nothing to watch. Though it promised to be nothing more than a near ruin, she decided to make it her destination. She'd get there, sit for a while, and then head back. She was getting thirsty, for one thing. She wanted a glass of water. Maybe on the return journey she'd pick up some soda from Niles' drugstore. She dug in her pocket just to see what she had. 2 singles, 1 $5, and 1 $10 bill. She pushed them down to the very bottom of her pocket so they wouldn't slip out. The wind had become stronger in the time since she had left the limits of Chickentown, and a little more bracing. There was still the smell of spring green in the air, but there was something else besides, something Candy couldn't quite name, but which teased her nevertheless. She walked toward the tower, her mind becoming pleasantly devoid of troubling thoughts. Miss Schwartz, letters threatening expulsion, her father in his drinking chair staring up at her with that look of his, the look she knew meant trouble, all of it was left behind where the street ended. Then her toe caught some object so that it skipped ahead of her through the grass. Just a stone, surely. Nevertheless, she bent down to take a closer look, and to her surprise she saw that it was not a stone at all, but a shell. It was large, too, about the size of her balled fist, and there were a number of short spikes on it. It wasn't, she knew, a snail shell. For one thing, it was too big, and she had never seen a snail shell with spikes. No, this was a seashell, and it was clearly old. Its colors had faded, but she could still see an elaborate pattern upon it, a design that followed its diminishing spiral. She turned it over, brushed what looked suspiciously like sand out of its crevice, and put it to her ear. It was a trick her grandfather had first taught her, listening to the sea in a shell. And though she knew it was just an illusion, the subtle reverberations of the air in the shell's interior, she was still half persuaded by it. Half certain she heard the sound of waves, as if the shell still had some memory of its life in the ocean. She listened. There it was. But what was a seashell doing out here? Had somebody dropped it while walking here? That seemed highly unlikely. Who went walking with seashells in their pocket? She looked down, wondering if anything else had been dropped in the vicinity. To her surprise, the answer was yes. There were a number of odd items scattered under her feet. More shells, for one thing. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Some small, a few even larger than the one she'd picked up. Most were cracked or broken, but some were still intact, their shapes and designs more beautiful, more bizarre than anything she'd ever seen in a book. And there was more besides, a lot more. As she studied the ground, her eyes becoming accustomed to picking out curiosities, the curiosities multiplied. There were pieces of wood scattered among the shells, most smoothed into little abstract sculptures by the pale freckled sand that was mingled with the dark Minnesota dirt. As she bent to pick one of the sculptures up, she saw that there was glass here, too. Countless fragments, green, blue, and white, turned into smoky jewels. She picked up 3 or 4 and examined them in the palm of her hand, walking a little way as she did so. There were more mysteries underfoot with every step she took. A large fish, its flesh pecked away by birds and the remains baked by the sun, and even a piece of pottery on which a fragment of an exquisite design remained, a blue figure staring at her with almost hypnotic intensity. Fascinated by all this, she paused to examine her finds more closely. As she did so, she caught a movement in the long grass out of the corner of her eye. She dropped down onto her haunches below the level of the tallest grass stalks, and there she stayed, suddenly and unaccountably nervous. She brushed the last of the sand off her fingers and watched for whatever had moved to move again. A hard gust of wind came through the grass, making it hiss as the stalks rubbed against one another. After perhaps a minute, during which the only motion was the bending of the grass, she decided to chance standing up. As she did so, the thing she had seen moving chose precisely the same moment to also stand upright, so that the pair of them, Candy and the stranger, rose like 2 swimmers emerging from a shallow sea. Candy let out a yelp of shock at the sight of the stranger, and then, once the shock had worn off, she started to laugh. The man, whoever he was wearing some kind of Halloween mask, or so it seemed. What other explanation could there be for his freakish appearance? His left eye was round and wild, while his right was narrow and sly, and his mouth, framed by a black mustache and beard, was downturned in misery. But none of this was as odd as what sprouted from the top of his head. There were large downy ears, and above them 2 enormous antlers which would have resembled those of a stag, except that there were 7 heads, 4 on the left horn, 3 on the right, growing from them. Heads with eyes, noses, and mouths. They weren't, she realized now, static, nor were they made of rubber and papier-mâché. In short, it wasn't a mask the man was wearing. These heads sprouting from the antlers were alive, and they were all staring at Candy the way their owner was staring at her. 8 pairs of eyes, all studying her with the same manic intensity. She was speechless, but they were not. After a moment of silence, the heads erupted into wild chatter, their manner highly agitated. Candy had no doubt about the subject of conversation. 1 minute the heads were looking at her, then they were facing one another, their volume rising as they attempted to out-talk one another. The only mouth that wasn't moving was that of the man himself. He simply studied Candy, his wild and sly expression slowly becoming one of tentative enquiry. Finally, he decided to approach her. Candy let out a little gasp of fear, and in response he raised his long-fingered hands as though to keep her from running away. The heads, meanwhile, were still chattering to one another. "Be quiet," he ordered them. "You're frightening the lady." All but one of the heads, the middle of the 2 on his right horn, a round-faced, sour individual, responded to his order. But this one kept talking. "Keep your distance from her, John Mischief," the head advised its big brother. "She may look harmless, but you can't trust them, any of them." "I said, 'Hush up, John Serpent,'" the man said, "and I mean it." The head made a face and muttered something under its breath, but it finally stopped talking. "What's your name?" John Mischief asked Candy. "Me," Candy said, as though there was anybody else in the vicinity to whom the question might be directed. "Oh, lordy-loo," another of the heads remarked. "Yes, you, girl." "Be polite, John Sallow," John Mischief said, reaching up, without taking his eyes off Candy, and lightly slapping the short-tempered head for its offense. Then, having hushed his companion, John Mischief said, "I do apologize for my brother, lady." Then, of all things, He bowed to her. It wasn't a deep bow, but there was something about the simple courtesy of the gesture that completely won Candy over. So what if John Mischief had 7 extra heads? He'd bowed to her and called her lady. Nobody had ever done that to her before. She smiled with improbable delight. And the impish man called John Mischief, along with 5 of his 7 siblings, smiled back. "Please," he said, "I don't wish to alarm you, lady. Believe me, that is the very last thing I wish to do. But there is somebody in this vicinity by the name of Shape." "Mendelssohn Shape," the smallest of the heads said. "As John Moot says, Mendelssohn Shape." Before Candy could deal with any more information, she needed a question answered, so she asked it. "Are you all called John?" she said. "Oh, yes," said Mischief. "Tell her, brothers, left to right. Tell her what we are called." So they did. John Fillet, John Sallow, John Moot, John Drowse, John Pluckett, John Serpent, John Slop. "And I'm the head brother," the 8th wonder replied, "John Mischief." "Yes, I heard that part. I'm Candy Quackenbush." "I am extremely pleased to make your acquaintance," John Mischief said. He sounded completely sincere in this, and with good reason. To judge by his appearance, things had not gone well for him or them of late. Mischief's striped blue shirt was full of holes, and there were stains on his loosely knotted tie which were either food or blood. She guessed the latter. Then there was his smell. He was less than sweet, to say the least. His shirt clung to his chest, soaked with pungent sweat. "Have you been running from this man's Shape?" Candy said. "She's observant," John Pluckett said appreciatively. "I like that. And young, which is good. She can help us, Mischief." "Either that or she can get us in even deeper trouble," said John Serpent. "We're as deep as we can get," John Slop observed. "I say we trust the girl, Mischief. We've got absolutely nothing to lose." "What are they all talking about?" Candy asked Mischief. "Besides me." "The harbor," he replied. "What harbor?" Candy said. "There's no harbor here. This is Minnesota. We're hundreds of miles from the ocean. No, thousands." "Perhaps we're thousands of miles from any ocean you're familiar with, lady," said John Fillet with a gap-toothed smile. "But there are oceans and oceans, seas and seas." "What on earth is he talking about?" Candy asked Mischief. John Mischief pointed toward the tower that stood 60 or 70 yards from where they stood. "That, lady, is a lighthouse," he said. "No," said Candy with a smile. The idea was preposterous. Why would anybody— "Look at it," said John Drowse. "It is a lighthouse." Candy studied the odd tower again. Yes, she could see that indeed it could have been designed as a lighthouse. There were the rotted remains of a staircase spiraling up the middle of it, leading to a room at the top which might have housed a lamp. But so what? "Somebody was crazy," she remarked. "Why?" said John Slop. "Oh, come on," said Candy. "We've been through this. We're in Minnesota. There is no sea in—" Candy stopped mid-sentence. Mischief had put his hand to his mouth, hushing her. As he did so, all of his brothers looked off in one direction or another. A few were sniffing the air, others tasting it on their lips. Whatever they did and wherever they looked, they all came to the same conclusion, and together they murmured 2 words. "Shape's here," they said.
This ends Disc 1. Abarat, Disc 2.
Chapter 6. The Lady Ascends. Mischief instantly grabbed Candy's arm and pulled her down into the long grass. His eyes were neither wild nor sly now. They were simply afraid. His brothers, meanwhile, were peering over the top of the grass in every direction and now and then exchanging their own fearful looks. It was most peculiar for Candy to be with one person and yet be in the company of a small crowd. "Lady," Mischief said very softly, "I wonder if you would dare something for me." "Dare? I would quite understand if you preferred not. This isn't your battle. But perhaps Providence put you here for a reason." "Go on," Candy said. Given how unhappy and purposeless she'd been feeling in the last few hours, no, not hours, months, even years, she was happy to listen to anybody with a theory about why she was here. "If I could distract Mendelssohn Shape's attention away from you for long enough, maybe you could get to the lighthouse and climb the stairs. You carry far less weight than I, and the stairs may support you better." "What for?" "What do you mean, what for?" "Well, once I've climbed the stairs—" "She wants to know what she does next," John Slop said. "That's simple enough, lady," said John Fillet. "When you get to the top," said John Pluckett, "you must light the light." Candy glanced up at the ruined tower, at the spiraling spire of its staircase and the rotting boards of its upper floor. She couldn't imagine the place was in working order, not in its present state. "Doesn't it need electricity?" she said. "I mean, I can't even see a lamp." "There's one up there, we swear," said John Moot. "Please trust us. We may be desperate, but we're not stupid. We wouldn't send you on a suicide mission." "So how do I make this lamp work?" Candy asked. "Is there an on-off switch?" "You'll know how to use it the moment you set eyes on it," Mischief said. "Light's the oldest game in the world." She looked at them, her gaze going from face to face. They looked so frightened, so exhausted. "Please, lady," said Mischief. "You're our only chance now." "Just one more question," Candy said. "No time," said Drowse. "I see shape." "Where?" said Fillet, turning to follow his brother's gaze. He didn't need any further direction. He simply said, "Oh, Lordy-Loo, there he is." Candy raised her head 6 inches and looked in the same direction that Fillet and Drowse were looking. The rest of the brothers, Mischief included, followed that stare. And there, no more than a stone's throw from the spot where Candy and the brothers were crouched in the grass, was the object of their fear. Mendelssohn Shape. The sight of him made Candy shudder. He was twice the height of Mischief, and there was something spiderish about his grotesque anatomy. His almost fleshless limbs were so long she could readily imagine him walking up a wall. On his back there was a curious arrangement of cruciform rods that almost looked like 4 swords which had been fused to his bony body. He was naked but for a pair of striped shorts, and he walked with a pronounced limp. But there was nothing frail about him. Despite the lack of muscle and that limp of his, he looked like a creature born to do harm. His expression was joyless and sour, filled with hatred toward the world. Having got herself a glimpse of him, Candy ducked down quickly before Shape's wrathful gaze came her way. Curiously, it was only now, seeing this second freakish creature, that she wondered if perhaps she wasn't having some kind of hallucination. How could such beings be here in the world with her? The same world as Chickentown, as Miss Schwartz and Deborah Hackbarth. "Before we go any further," she said to the brothers, "I need an answer to something." "Ask away," said John Swallow. "Am I dreaming this?" By way of reply, all 8 brothers shook their heads, their faces for once expressing the same thing. "No, this is no dream," those faces said. Nor, deep in her bones, had she expected the answer to be any different. They were all awake together, she and the brothers, and all in terrible jeopardy. Mischief saw the sequence of thoughts crossing her face, the doubt that she was even awake, and then the fear that indeed she was. "This is all Providence, I swear," he said to her. "You're here because you can light the light. You and only you." She did her best to put the fear out of her head and to concentrate on what John Mischief had just said. In a curious way, it made sense that she was here because she had to be here. She thought of the doodle she'd made on her workbook, the way it had seemed to brighten in her mind's eye, inspiring her limbs to move. It was almost as though the doodle had been a sign, a ticket to this adventure. Why else, after living all her life in Chicken Town, should she be here, in a place she'd never been before, today? This must be what John Mischief meant by Providence. "So, lady," Mischief said, "what is your decision?" "If I'm not dreaming this, then perhaps it is Providence." "So you'll go?" "Yes, I'll go," Candy said simply. Mischief smiled again, only this time they all smiled with him. 8 grateful faces smiling at her for being here and ready to chance her life. That was what was at stake right now, she didn't doubt it. The monster moving through the grass nearby would kill them all if he got his claws into them. "Good luck," Mischief whispered. "We'll see you again when you come down." And without offering any further instruction, he and his brothers darted off through the grass, bent double to keep out of Shape's sight until they were clear of her. Candy's heart was thumping so hard she could hear her pulse in her head. 10, 15 seconds passed. She listened. The grass hissed all around her. Strangely enough, she had never felt so alive in her life. Another half-minute went by. She was tempted to chance another peep above the surface of the swaying grass to see whether Mendelssohn's Shape was limping in her direction, but she was afraid to do so in case he was almost upon her. Then, to her infinite relief, she heard 8 voices all yelling at the same time. "Hey you! Mendelssohn Schmendelssohn! Looking for us? We're over here!" Candy waited a heartbeat, then chanced a look. Shape, it seemed, had indeed been looking in her direction, and had she raised her head a second earlier, would have seen her. But now he was swinging around, following the sound of the brothers' voices. At that moment, Mischief leaped up out of the grass and began racing away from the lighthouse, diverting Shape's attention. Shape threw open his arms, his huge iron-taloned claws spread as wide as 5-fingered fans. "There you are!" he roared. His voice was as ugly as his anatomy, a guttural din that made Candy's stomach churn. As he spoke, the configuration of crosses on his back shifted, rising up like featherless, metallic wings. He reached over his shoulders and grabbed 2 of the blades, pulling them out of the scabbards in his leathery flesh. Then he started through the grass toward his prey. Candy knew she couldn't afford to delay. The brothers were chancing their lives so that she could attempt to reach the lighthouse unseen. She had to go now, or their courage would be entirely in vain. Candy didn't watch the pursuit a moment longer. Instead, she set her eyes on the lighthouse and she began to run, not even bothering to try and conceal herself by staying below the level of the grass. Simply depending for distraction upon Shape's terrible appetite to have the John brothers in his grasp. As she raced through the grass, she became aware that the great rain cloud that had first caught her eye was now directly above the lighthouse, hovering like a golden curtain over the drama below. Was this part of the makings of Providence, too? She wondered as she ran. Did clouds also have their place in the shape of things? By the time the thought had passed through her head, she had reached the threshold of the lighthouse. She chanced a quick look over her shoulder at Mischief and his pursuer. Much to her horror, she saw that her brief period of protection was over. Shape had given up chasing the brothers, realizing perhaps that the pursuit was just a diversion, and he had now turned his attention back toward the lighthouse. His eyes fixed upon Candy, and he let out a blood-curdling cry at the sight of her. He spread his arms wide, and with swords in hand he began to move toward her. He didn't run. He simply strode through the grass with terrible confidence in his uneven step, as if to say, "I don't have to hurry. I've got all the time in the world. I've got you cornered, and there's no escape for you. You're mine." She turned away from the sight of his approach and pushed on the broken door. The hinges creaked, and there were a few moments of resistance when she feared that fallen timbers on the other side might have blocked it. Then, with a deep grating sound, the door opened and Candy slipped inside. Though there were plenty of holes in the walls and the sun came through in solid shafts, it was still far chillier inside than it was out. The cold air stank of rotting wood. Large fungi had prospered in the damp murk, and the boards beneath her feet were slick with mildew. She slipped twice before she had even reached the bottom of the stairs. The prospect before her looked dangerous. No doubt once upon a time the spiral wooden stairs had been perfectly safe to climb, but that was decades ago. Now all but a few of the railings had collapsed, and the structure which had supported the staircase had been devoured by woodworm and rot, so that it seemed the stairs themselves had virtually nothing to depend on for their solidity. She peered through one of the holes in the wall just to confirm what she already knew. Mendelssohn's shape was still advancing toward the lighthouse. Unlikely as a safe ascent seemed, there was no way back now. Shape would be at the front door in just a few seconds. She had no choice but to try the stairs. She put her hand on the shaky banister and began her cautious ascent. Outside in the long grass, the John brothers watched the silhouetted form of the Lady Quackenbush as she started up the stairs. "She's something special, that one," Drowse murmured. "What makes you say that?" Moot remarked. "Look at her," Drowse said. "Not many creatures of this wretched hereafter would be so brave." "She's half mad," said Serpent. "That's why. I saw it in her eyes, right from the beginning. She's a little bit crazy." "So we send a crazy girl to do our handiwork for us?" Pluckett said. "That's not very heroic." "Will you just shut your cake holes, all of you?" Mischief snapped. "Drowse is right. There is something about the lady. When we first laid eyes on her, didn't anybody think they'd maybe seen her before?" There was silence from above. "Well?" "You told us to shut our cake holes," Sallow reminded him airily. "We're just obeying instructions." "Well, I think she's got a touch of magic about her," Mischief said, ignoring Sallow's riposte. He went to his belt and unsheathed the little knife that hung there. "And we have to protect her." "You're not," Moot began. "Intending to attack," Pluckett continued. "Mendelssohn's shape," Slop went on. "Not with that pitiful excuse for a weapon," Phillip concluded. "Well," said Mischief, "unless somebody has a better idea." "He's twice our size," said Sallow. "3 times," said Moot. "He'll tear out our heart," said Slop. "Well, we can't leave the Lady Quackenbush undefended," Mischief replied. "I vote we run," Moot said. "This is a lost cause, Mischief. At least if we get away now, the key's safe with us. If we throw ourselves into the fray, we're not just endangering our lives, which are very valuable," John Serpent remarked. "We're endangering the key," Moot reasoned. "We can't afford to do that." "Moot's right," said John Sallow. "We've got a chance to run. I vote we take it." "Out of the question," Mischief remarked. "She's risking her life for us." "As I observed," Sallow replied, "the creature's half mad." "And as I said," Mischief replied. "You can all shut your cake holes because you're wasting your breath. We're going to keep Shape away from her as long as we can." So saying, Mischief set off running through the grass toward Mendelssohn, his little knife at the ready. As he came within 6 or 7 strides of his target, Shape sensed his presence and swung around, the swords whining through the air. His mouth was wide and foamy, as though he was working up an appetite as he approached the tower. The pupils of his eyes had gone to pinpricks, giving him an even more monstrous expression. His aim was poor. The blades missed the brothers by a foot or more, simply lopping off the feathery heads of the prairie grass. Mischief just ducked down and doubled his speed, running at the enemy. "Everybody," he said, "give the warriors yell!" At which point all the Johns loosed a cry so discordant, so insane, so bestial, "Yeah!" that even Shape hesitated and for a moment looked as though he might retreat. Then he seemed to remember the absurdity of his enemy, and instead of backing away, he came at them again with the swords. But the Johns were swift. Mischief darted under Shape's vast hand and pushed his little blade into Shape's thigh. The knife went in 3 or 4 inches and lodged there, blood spurting over Mischief's hand and arm. It was enough to make the monster let out a cry of rage and pain. He dropped the blades and clutched the wound, gritting his teeth as he pulled the knife out. Inside the lighthouse, Candy had climbed 15 steps when she heard Mendelssohn shout. She carefully ascended another 3 until she could see through a hole in the wall. She had quite a good view. She could see that Mischief was playing David to Shape's Goliath out there. The sight gave her courage. Instead of advancing up the stairs tentatively, as she'd been doing, she picked up her speed. With every step she took, the whole structure rocked and groaned, but she reached the top of the flight without incident and found herself in a round room, perhaps 8 or 9 feet across. She'd reached the top of the lighthouse. But now that she was actually up here, where was the light? It was just as she'd feared. If there'd ever been a light up here, which she strongly doubted, this place was more folly than functional, then it had been stolen long ago, leaving just one strange item in the middle of the room. An inverted pyramid, perhaps 3 feet high and carefully balanced on its tip, its 3 sides decorated with a number of designs like hieroglyphics. On the top of the pyramid, or rather on what had been its base, was a small, simple bowl. The purpose to which any of this obscure arrangement might have been put escaped Candy entirely. Then she recalled what Mischief had said when she'd remarked that she couldn't even see a lamp up at the top of the tower. What was it exactly? He'd said something about light being the oldest game in the world. Perhaps this odd creation represented some kind of game, she thought. The problem was that she had no idea how to play it. And now, as if matters weren't bad enough, she heard the din of Shape beating down the lighthouse door, smashing it to smithereens in his fury. The noise reached a chaotic climax, followed by a few seconds of silence. Then came the limping footfall of the monster himself as he climbed the lighthouse stairs to find her. Chapter 7. Light and Water. "Where are you, child?" Shape growled as he ascended. The sound of his voice and the thump and drag of his limping step froze Candy for a moment. This was like something from a nightmare, being hunted down by some hellish beast, some vile creature that wanted to eat her alive, limb by limb, finger by finger. No! She shook herself from her trance of terror. She wasn't going to let this abomination take her. She looked around the room for a door that led out onto the narrow balcony that encircled the room. The door in question was directly behind her. She went over to it and turned the handle. It was locked, but that presented no problem to her, not in her present panicked state. She put her shoulder to the rotted wood and forced it open quite easily. Then she stepped out onto the balcony. The boards had been more exposed to the extremes of Minnesota's summers and winters than the interior floors, and they instantly gave way beneath her weight. She threw herself forward and grabbed hold of the rusted iron railing. Her speed probably saved her life, because 2 heartbeats later the whole patch of floorboards beneath her right foot crumbled away. Had she not had the support of the railing, she would have surely fallen through the hole and probably dropped to her death. Very gingerly, she hauled her foot out of the hole and sought a more reliable place to stand. She could still hear Shape in the tower behind her, calling out sing-song threats to her as he climbed. It was some horrible little nursery song he was singing, the kind only a monster like Shape would have sung to him in his cradle. Oh, little one, my little one, come with me, your life is done. Forget the future, forget the past. Life is over, breathe your last. Doing her best to blot out the sound of Shape's obscene little lullaby, she scanned the landscape around the lighthouse. "Mischief!" she yelled. "Where did you go?" She only had to call once. Then he was there racing toward the tower through the grass. There was blood on his hands, she saw. Had he wounded Shape? She dared hope so. "Lady Candy, are you all right?" "I can't find any light up here, Mischief. I'm sorry." "He's coming, lady." "I know, Mischief. Believe me, I know. But there's no light." "There should be a cup and ball up there. Isn't there a cup and ball?" "What?" "The oldest game, Candy. Light is the oldest game." Candy glanced back inside. Yes, there was a cup of sorts sitting on top of the inverted pyramid. "Yes, there's a cup," she yelled back down to the brothers. "Put the ball in it," Mischief replied. "What ball? There isn't any ball." "There should be a ball." "Well, there isn't one." "So look," yelled John Serpent. Candy didn't waste time telling Serpent to be more polite. She had only seconds to spare before Shape made an entrance into the round room she knew. So she stopped talking and did as Mischief suggested, stepping over the hole she had made in the platform and returning to look for the ball. She listened as she scoured the room. To judge by the sound of his feet, Shape was close to the top of the stairs. Then, just as she was certain he was about to open the door, she heard the welcome sound of splintering timber, and her pursuer loosed a shout of alarm. His weight had apparently been too much for the staircase. She heard a series of crashes as broken portions of the steps fell away into the stairwell. A moment of silence followed, when she dared hope that perhaps Shape had fallen down the stairwell along with the broken stairs and was lying at the bottom of the flight. But instead of the distant moans she'd hoped to hear, there came an outburst of words in a language she had never heard before. She didn't need a translator to recognize them as curses. She crossed to the door and glanced down just to see what had happened. A large portion of the staircase, 5 or 6 stairs, had indeed collapsed under Mendelssohn Shape's weight, but he had somehow managed to avoid the full fall by jumping back down the stairs before they had collapsed beneath him. This left a sizable gap for him to get across before he could continue his ascent. She was disappointed that he wasn't dead or comatose at the bottom, but this was better than nothing. Looking up at her, he made horns of his forefinger and smallest finger, which he jabbed threateningly in Candy's direction. No doubt, had he possessed the power to strike her dead on the spot, dead she would have been. But all he could do was curse and point, so she left him to it and went back to search for the missing ball. As she did so, she heard Mischief yelling up at her from outside. Obviously, he'd heard the din. "I'm coming in, Lady Candy." She went to the outer door and called down to him. "No! Stay where you are! You can't get up here anyway! The stairs have collapsed!" She saw him looking through the holes in the tower wall to confirm what she'd told him. He was aghast. "How will you get down?" he said, apparently more concerned with her safety now than with the oldest game in the world. "I'll find a way when the time comes," Candy said. "First, I'm going to find this stupid ball." "We're coming in," he said again. "Wait," she told him. "You just stay there, please." Without waiting for an answer, she went down on her haunches and started a systematic search of the floor, looking for the missing part of this bizarre puzzle. It was not immediately visible, but there were several places where the boards had rotted completely, leaving holes in the floor. She went to each one, pulling up the worm-eaten boards to get a better look at what lay beneath. They came away easily in showers of splinters, dust, and dried beetle corpses. The first hole revealed nothing. The second, the same. But the third was the charm. There it was, rolled away under the boards, a small turquoise and silver ball. She had to tear away a little more of the rotted boards before she could fish it out between her fingers. When she finally succeeded, she discovered that it was surprisingly heavy for its size. It wasn't wood or plastic. It was metal, and elegantly engraved on its blue-green surface was a design she knew. There it was, etched into the metal, the doodle she had drawn so obsessively in her workbook. She didn't have any time to wonder at this. Behind her, she heard a series of fierce grunts from the stairwell, followed by another crash. She knew in an instant what was going on. In his ambition to get to her, Shape had dared to try and jump the gap in the stairs. She glanced up at the door, which stood open a few inches. Through it, she could see Shape. He had succeeded in leaping over the gap, and he was coming up the remaining stairs 2 at a time, his razor claws making a horrid squeal on the timbers that lined the stairwell. Candy looked at the small, simple cup that sat on the pyramid. Mischief's words echoed in her head. "Light's the oldest game in the world." Shape was at the door, staring with one pinprick pupil through the crack at Candy, his jaws wide, dripping foam like the maw of a mad dog. He started to sing his lullaby again, but more softly now, more liltingly. "Forget the future, forget the past. Life is over, breathe your last." As he sang, he pushed the door slowly, as though this was some game. Candy didn't have time to cross to the pyramid and put the ball in the cup. If she wasted those 3 or 4 seconds, then Shape would be through the door and tearing out her throat, no doubt of it. She had no choice. She had to play the game. She took a deep breath and threw the ball. It wasn't a good throw. The ball hit the edge of the cup instead of landing in it, and for several seconds it circled the rim, threatening to topple out. "Please," she willed it quietly, staring at the ball like a gambler watching a roulette wheel, knowing she had this throw and only this throw. There would be no second chance. And still the ball rolled around the rim of the cup, undecided where to fall. "Go on," she murmured, trying to ignore the creak of the door behind her. The ball made one last lazy circle of the rim and then rocked back and forth for a moment and toppled into the cup, rattling around for a few seconds before finally settling. Shape let out a sound that was as far from human as any throat that was fashioned like his could make. A profound din that rose from a hiss to the noise of a creature tormented to the edge of madness. As he loosed this unearthly sound, he pushed open the door, threw Candy aside, and reached for the ball so as to snatch it out of the cup. But the tower was having none of that. Some process beyond Candy's comprehension had begun with that simple throw of hers. An invisible force was in the air, and it pitched Shape back, its power sufficient to carry him out through the door. Outside, Candy heard Mischief and his brothers whooping like a pack of ecstatic dogs. Though they couldn't possibly see what she'd done, they knew she'd succeeded. Nor was it hard for Candy to understand how they knew. There was a wave of pure energy emanating from the pyramid. She felt the fine hairs at the base of her skull starting to prickle, and behind her eyes the design of the ball turned blue and green and gold. She retreated a step, then another, her eyes fixed on the ball, cup, and pyramid. And then, to her astonishment, the pyramid began to move on its pinpoint axis. It quickly gathered speed, and as it did so, a fire seemed to be ignited in its heart, and a silvery luminescence, flickering tentatively at first, but quickly becoming solid and strong, flowed out through the designs on the sides of the device. It was just before noon in Minnesota. Even with a thin cloud layer covering the sun, the day was still bright. But the light that now began to spill through the hieroglyphics on the spinning pyramid was brighter still. They were brilliant streams pouring out in all directions. She heard a soft, almost mournful noise from Mendelssohn Shape. She glanced over at him. He was staring at the device with all the malice, all the intent to do harm drained from his face. He was apparently resigned to whatever happened next. He could do nothing about the phenomenon except watch it. "Now look what you've done," he said very, very softly. "What exactly have I done?" she said. "See for yourself," he replied, and for a moment he unhooked his gaze from the spinning pyramid so as to nod out at the world beyond the lighthouse. She didn't have any fear of turning her back on him now, At least until this miraculous process was over, it seemed, he was pacified. She went to the door and stepped out, over the hole she had made, to stand on the platform and see what she and the game of ball and cup had brought into being. The first thing she noticed was the blossom cloud. It was no longer moving slowly, responding to the gentle dictates of the wind. It was moving speedily overhead like an immense golden wheel with the tower in which she stood as its axis. She stood and admired the sight for a few moments, amazed at it. Then she looked down at the John brothers, who had turned their faces from the tower and were all looking out across the wide expanse of open prairie. What were they looking at, she wondered. She knew there was nothing out there for many miles, not so much as a house. For some reason, though the suburbs of Chickentown had spread in every other direction from the heart of the town, they had never spread northwest beyond Widow White's house. This was empty land, unused, unwanted. And yet, there was something out there that John Mischief and his siblings wanted to see. Mischief was cupping his hands over his eyes as he stared into the far away. Candy could feel the light from the pyramid like a physical presence pressing against her back. It wasn't an unpleasant sensation. In fact, it was quite pleasurable. She imagined that she could sense the power of the light passing through her body, lending her its strength. She seemed to feel it being carried through her veins, spilling out of her pores and out on her breath. It was just a trick her mind was playing, she suspected, but then perhaps not. Today she couldn't be certain of anything. Behind her, Mendelssohn's Shape let out a plaintive moan, and a moment later 8 throats loosed a chorus of shouts from below. "What is it?" she called down to them. "Look, lady, look!" She looked, following the brothers' collective gaze, and all that she'd seen today, all in fact that she'd ever seen in her life up to this extraordinary moment, became a kind of overture, and the astonishments began. There, in the distance, approaching over the rock and grass of Minnesota, rolling out of nowhere, there came a glittering sea. Candy's eyes had always been good. Nobody in her family wore glasses. She knew her gaze didn't deceive her. There were waves coming, foaming as they rolled and broke and rolled again. Now she knew what she'd done up in the tower. She had called this sea out of the air, and like a dog answering the summons of its master, the waters were coming. "You did it!" Mischief was hollering, jumping up and down and twisting full circle in the air. "You did it, lady! Oh, look, look!" He turned to stare up at her, his tears of bliss pouring down his face. "You see the waters?" "I see them," she shouted down to him, smiling at his joy. Then, more quietly, she said, "Murkett was right." The grasslands were still visible beneath the approaching tide, but the closer the sea came, the less solid the real world appeared to be, and the more the power of the waves took precedence. It wasn't just her sight that confirmed the reality of the approaching tide. She could smell the tang of the salt water on the wind. She could hear the draw and boom of the waves as they came closer, eroding the world she'd thought until now was the only one that existed, drowning it beneath the surf. "It's called the Sea of Isabella," Mendelssohn's Shape said behind her. Did she hear yearning in his voice? She thought she did. "That's where you come from?" "Not from the sea, from the islands, from the Abarat." Abarat? The word was completely foreign to her, but he spoke of it so confidently, how could she believe it did not exist? The islands of the Abarat. "But you'll never see them," Shape said, the expression on his face losing its dreaminess, becoming threatening again. "The Abarat isn't for human eyes. You belong in this world, the hereafter. I won't let you go into the water. I won't, you hear me?" The brief moment of gentility had apparently passed. He was once again his old savage self. He pulled himself to his feet, blood running freely from the wound Mischief had made in his leg, and started toward her. Candy took a stumbling step backward out of the door onto the broken platform. The wind had suddenly become chillier and stronger, its gusts carrying drops of moisture against her face. It wasn't rain that the wind carried, it was flecks of sea surf. She could taste their salt on her lips. "Mischief!" she yelled, taking a careful step back over the hole in the platform and grabbing hold of the iron railing to keep herself from slipping. Shape was ducking through the door, his arms so long he was able to reach over the hole. One hand snatched hold of her belt with his fingers, his nails slicing the fabric of her blouse. The other went up to her throat, which it immediately encircled. She attempted to call for Mischief a second time, and at the same time tried to turn and look for him, but she could do neither. Shape had too tight a stranglehold upon her. She tried again to call out, but seeing what she was attempting to do, Shape tightened his grip still further till tears of pain sprang into Candy's eyes and blotches of whiteness appeared at the corners of her vision. Desperate now, she reached up and grabbed at his vast hand, trying to tear it away from her throat. She was going to pass out very quickly if she couldn't get him to loosen his grip. But she didn't have the strength to pry so much as a single finger loose, and now the whiteness was spreading, threatening to blot out the world. She had one tiny hope. As the incident on the stairs had proved, the tower's rotting structure wasn't strong enough to support a creature of Shape's size and weight. If she could just pull him out from the doorway onto the boards of the platform, which her own weight had cracked, then maybe there was a chance that the boards would collapse beneath him as the stairs had. She knew she had seconds at best to do something to save herself. His grip was like a vice, steadily closing. Her head was throbbing as though it was going to explode. She grabbed hold of the railing again and inched her way along it in the hope of pulling him after her, but even that was a lost cause. Her body was almost drained of strength. She looked into Shape's face as he continued to tighten his grasp on her neck. He was grinning with satisfaction, his eyes reflecting the bright waters that were assembling behind her, his teeth a grotesque parade of gray points like the arrowheads she had found sometimes lying in the long grass as a child. That was the last thought that passed through her head before unconsciousness overtook her. Shape had a mouthful of chiseled arrowheads. Then she seemed to feel the world crack beneath her, and his hands slid off her throat as the platform folded up beneath them. There was a great eruption of splintered wood and a shout of alarm from Shape. His hands slipped off her neck, and suddenly she was falling through the broken platform, dropping to the ground in a rain of broken planks. Had she been conscious when she fell, she would have done herself very considerable damage, but luckily she passed out as she fell and thus landed with every muscle in her body relaxed. And there she lay, lost to the world, sprawled in the grass at the foot of the lighthouse, while the waters of the Sea of Isabella came rolling in to meet their summoning light. Chapter 8. A Moment with Melissa. Several miles away from the place where her daughter lay unconscious in the grass, Melissa Quackenbush was out in the backyard of 34 Followell Street, cleaning the barbecue after work. It was a task she hated, scraping pieces of burned-to-charcoal chicken meat off the grill, while the armies of ants that had been devouring the remains scattered in all directions. Of course, it was always her job, never her husband's. The lump, she called him behind his back, and not fondly. Right now he was sitting inside, slumped in front of some game show that he was only half watching through a haze of beer. In the early days after his being laid off, his lack of motivation to get up and find himself a new job had angered her, but now she was resigned to it, just as she was resigned to scraping off the remains of last week's barbecue from the grill. It was her life. It wasn't what she'd wanted, nor what she'd dreamed for herself, not remotely, but it was all she had. The lump, and the kids, and a barbecue grill caked with carbonized chicken. And then, just as she was finishing with the task, she felt a gust of wind coming from somewhere far, far off. She'd worked up quite a sweat as she scraped at the caked meat, and the wind was welcome, cooling the beads of perspiration on her forehead and the back of her neck, where her graying hair had stuck to her skin. But it wasn't the temperature of the wind that made her close her eyes and luxuriate in it. No, it was the smell that it carried on its back. Absurd as it was, she could smell the sea. It was impossible, of course. How could the wind be carrying a smell over 1,000 miles? But even as half her mind was saying, "This can't possibly be the sea that I'm smelling," the other half was murmuring, "But it is, it is." Another gust came against her face, and this time the smell it brought, and the feelings the smell evoked, were so strong they almost overwhelmed her. She dropped the can of cleaning spray. She dropped the metal spatula she'd been using to scrape off the meat. As they hit the paving stones, a memory came into her head from some long ago. It was a memory she wasn't even sure she was pleased to be conjuring up, but she had no choice in the matter. It came into her mind's eye so powerfully, so clearly, that it might have happened yesterday. She remembered rain battering down on the top of the old Ford truck she and Bill had owned when they'd first been married. They'd run out of gas in the middle of the rainstorm, and Bill had gone off to fetch enough gas to get them running again, leaving her alone in the middle of the downpour that had come out of nowhere. Alone in the dark and the cold. Well, no, that wasn't altogether true. She hadn't been completely alone. There'd been a baby in her belly. As Melissa had sat in that cold truck waiting for Bill to come back, Candy Francesca Quackenbush had been just an hour from being born. It was 2 a.m, and Melissa's water had just broken, and so, it seemed, had the waters of heaven itself, because to this day she couldn't remember being in a rainstorm so sudden and so intense. But it wasn't the rain or the cold or the kicking of the unborn child in her womb that she was remembering now. Something else had happened. Something that the smell of seawater now pricking her nostrils had brought back into her head. The trouble was she couldn't remember precisely what that something had been. She stepped away from the barbecue, away from the smell of burned chicken and cleaning fluid, to get a breath of purer air. And as she did so, as she inhaled the sea air that could not be sea air, another piece of the vision snapped into focus in her mind's eye. She'd been sitting there in the truck, with the rain beating a crazy tattoo on the roof, and suddenly, without warning, there had been light everywhere, flooding the old Ford's interior. Melissa didn't know why, but this memory, the vehicle filling up with pure white light, was somehow connected to the smell in the air. It didn't make any sense. Clearly her mind was playing tricks with her. Was she going crazy? Crazy with sadness and disappointment? Her eyes had started to sting, and tears now ran down her cheeks. Ran and ran. She told herself not to be silly. What was she crying about? "I'm not crazy," she said to herself softly. Nevertheless, she felt suddenly lost, unanchored. There was an explanation for this somewhere in her memory. The trouble was that she couldn't quite reach it. "Come on," she said to herself. It was like having a name on the tip of her tongue but not being able to bring it to mind. Frustrated with herself and more than a little unnerved, maybe there was something wrong with her, smelling the ocean in the middle of Minnesota. Maybe her life was making her nuts. She turned her back on the open sky and returned rather deliberately to the cloud of sour but familiar smells that hung around the barbecue. They weren't pleasant, but at least she understood them. Wiping her tears away with the back of her hand, she told herself to forget what she thought she was smelling, because it was a trick her nose was playing on her, no more nor less than that. Then she picked up the spatula and the can of cleaning fluid that she had dropped, and she went back to her weary and unhappy work. Chapter 9. Events on the Jetty. Candy heard a chorus of voices, all speaking the same word. "Lady," they were saying. "Lady, lady, lady." It took her several moments to realize that these many voices were all addressing her. It was the Johns speaking. Mischief, Fillet, Sallow, Moot, Drowse, Plucket, Serpent, and Slop. They were all calling to her, trying to get her to wake up. She felt herself tentatively shaken, and, just as tentatively, she opened her eyes. 8 concerned faces were looking down at her, 1 large one and 7 smaller. "Anything broken?" John Phillott said. Candy made a very cautious attempt to sit up. The back of her neck hurt, but it was no worse than the ache she sometimes woke with when she'd been sleeping in an odd position. She moved her legs and her arms. She wriggled her fingers. "No," she said, somewhat surprised at her good fortune, given the distance she'd fallen. "I don't think anything's broken." "Good," said John Sallow. "Then we can get moving." "Wait," said Mischief. "She's only just—" "Sallow's right," said John Phillott. "We haven't got time to wait. That damnable creep Shape is going to be down here in a few seconds." Shape. The sound of his name was enough to make Candy seize Mischief's arm and haul herself to her feet. The last thing she wanted was Mendelssohn Shape's claws around her throat a second time. "Where are we off to?" she wanted to know. "We're going home, lady," Mischief said. "You're going to yours, and we're going to ours." He put his hand into his inside pocket. "But before I go," he said, dropping his voice to a whisper as he spoke, "I wonder if you could possibly do something for me, for us all, until we meet again?" "What do you need?" Candy said. "I just need you to carry something for us, something very precious." From the interior of his jacket he brought an object wrapped up in a little piece of coarsely woven cloth and secured with a brown leather thong that had been wrapped around it several times. "There's no need for you to know what it is," he said. "In fact, if you don't mind, it's better you don't. Just take it and keep it safe for us, will you? We'll be back, I promise you, when Carrion's forgotten about us and we can chance the return trip." "Carrion?" "Christopher Carrion," John Serpent said, his voice laden with anxiety. "The Lord of Midnight." "Will you take it for us?" said John Mischief, proffering the little parcel. "I think if I'm going to carry something," Candy said, "I should at least know what it is, especially if it's important." "What did I tell you?" Serpent said. "I knew she wouldn't be content with that 'it's better if you don't know' line. She's entirely too inquisitive, this one." "Well, if I'm going to be a messenger girl," Candy said, addressing John Serpent, "I think I have a right." "Of course you do," Mischief said. "Open it up." "Go on, it's all yours." Curiously enough, the little parcel seemed to have almost no weight except for that of the wrapping and the cord. Candy pulled at the large knot, which, although it looked hard to undo, seemed to solve itself the moment she began to pick at it. She felt something move in the parcel. The next moment there was a rush of light out of the bag which momentarily filled her gaze. She saw several points of brightness appear before her, joined by darting lines of luminescence. They hovered for a moment, then the lights sank away into her unconscious and were gone. The whole spectacle, which couldn't have taken more than 3 seconds, left her speechless. "You have the key now," John Mischief told her gravely. "I beg you to tell nobody you have it. Do you understand? Nobody." "Whatever you say," she replied, looking at the empty bag, mystified. Then, after a moment, "I don't suppose you're going to tell me what door this key opens?" "Truly, lady, better not." He kissed her hand, bowing as he did so, and began to retreat from her. "Goodbye, lady," he said. "We have to go." Candy had been facing the tower throughout this conversation. Only now, as Mischief retreated from her, did she realize what a change had come over the world in the brief time in which she'd been unconscious. A ramshackle jetty had appeared out of the ground, and at its far end large waves were breaking, their weight sufficient to make the structure creak and shake down its entire length. Beyond the breaking waves, the Sea of Isabella stretched off toward a misty blue horizon. Minnesota, at least as Candy had known it, had apparently disappeared, overwhelmed by this great expanse of invading water. "How," Candy said, staring at the panorama, slack-jawed with astonishment, "how is this possible?" "You called the waters, lady. You remember, with the cup and ball?" "I remember," she said. "Now I must go home on those waters," Mischief said. "And you must go back home to Chickentown. I'll return, I promise, when it's safe to do so. And I'll claim the key. In the meanwhile, you cannot imagine what service you do to freedom throughout the islands by being the keeper of that key." He bowed to her again, and then, politely but firmly, he nodded toward Chickentown. "Go home, lady," he said, like a man attempting to send home a dog that didn't want to leave his side. "Go back where you're safe before Shape gets down from the tower. Please. What you carry is of great significance. It can't be allowed to fall into Shape's hands, or rather, into the hands of his master." "Why not? What happens if it does?" "I beg you, lady," Mischief said, the urgency in his voice mounting. "Ask no more questions. The less you know, the better for you. If things go wrong in the Aberrat and they come looking for you, you can claim ignorance. Now there's no more time for conversation." He had reason for his urgency. There was a loud noise from out of the tower behind them as Shape attempted to clamber back down the broken staircase. Judging by the din from within, it wasn't an easy job. His weight was causing yet more of the structure to collapse, but it would only be a matter of time, Candy knew, before he navigated the remnants of the staircase and was out through the door in pursuit of them all. "All right," she said reluctantly, conceding the urgency of her departure. "I'll go, but before I go, I have to have one proper look." "At what?" "The sea," Candy said, pointing off down the jetty toward the open expanse of bright blue water. "She'll be the death of us," Serpent growled. "No," said Mischief. "She has a perfect right." Mischief grabbed hold of Candy's hand and helped her up onto the jetty. It creaked and swayed beneath them. But having dared the tower's stairs and balcony, Candy wasn't in the least intimidated by a little rotten wood. The jetty shook violently with every wave that struck it, but she was determined to get to the end of it and see the Sea of Isabella for herself. "It's amazing," she said as they proceeded down the length of the jetty. She'd never seen the sea before. All thought of Shape and his claws had vanished from her head. She was entranced by the spectacle before her. "I still don't see how it can have happened," she said. "A sea coming out of nowhere." "Oh, this is the least of it, lady," Mischief said. "Out there, far off from here, are the 25 islands of the Aberrat." 25? One for every hour of the day, plus the 25th hour, which is called Autumn Spire, which is a time out of time. It all sounded too strange and preposterous, but then here she was, standing on a jetty looking out over a sea that hadn't existed 10 minutes before. If the sea was real, and real it was, or else why was her face cold and wet? Then why not the islands, too, waiting where the Sea of Isabella met the sky? They had come to the end of the jetty. She gazed out over the waters. Fish leaped up, silver and green. The wind carried seabirds the likes of which she had never seen or heard before. In just a few seconds, Mischief and his brothers were going to be gone into these mysterious waters, and she was going to be left to return to her boring, suffocating life in Chickentown. Oh, God, Chickentown! After all this, these wonders, these miracles, Chickentown! The thought was unbearable. "When will you come back?" she said to Mischief. "Wait, lady," Mischief replied. "What?" "Stay very still." As he spoke, he went into the outer pocket of his jacket and he pulled out, of all things, an old-fashioned pistol. It was a small weapon, and it looked as though it was made of brass. "What are you doing?" she said, dropping her voice to a whisper. "Doing what I can," he said softly, "to save our lives." She saw his eyes flicker over his shoulder in the direction of somebody on the jetty behind her. "Shape?" she murmured. "Shape," he replied. "Please, lady, don't move." So saying, he suddenly stepped to the side of her and he fired. There was a loud crack, and a plume of purple-blue smoke erupted from the barrel of the pistol. A moment later there was a second sound, much less loud, as the bullet struck its intended target. Candy knew immediately what John Mischief had done. He hadn't shot Shape. He'd fired at the cup on the top of the pyramid, and the ball had jumped out of it. She could instantly sense the massive change in the air around them. "Nice shot," said Sallow. "Though why you couldn't have put a bullet through Shape's eye defeats me." "I take no pleasure in putting holes in living things," Mischief said, pocketing the gun. Candy glanced over her shoulder. Shape was standing about halfway along the jetty, glancing back toward the tower. It was clear that he, too, knew what Mischief had done. How could he doubt it? The air was vibrating with the news. "The tide's changing, lady," Mischief said, "and I have to go with it. Shape will follow me, all being well, because he believes I have the key." "No, wait," Candy said, seizing hold of Mischief's arm. "Don't do this." "Don't do what?" said John Moot. "I don't want to go back to Chicken Town." "Where else can you go?" said John Sallow. "With you." "No," said John Serpent. "Yes," said Candy. "Please, I want to go into the water." "You have no idea of the risks you'd be taking." "I don't care," Candy said. "I hate where I live. I hate it with all my heart." As she spoke, she felt the wind change direction. The waters around the jetty had become highly agitated now, almost frenzied, in fact. The tide was turning on itself, and in the process making the antiquated boards of the jetty rattle and shake. She knew she only had a few seconds to persuade Mischief and his brothers. Then they'd be gone, into the water and away with the tide, away to Aberrat, wherever that was. And what chance did she have of ever seeing them again once they'd gone? Sure, they'd tell her they'd come back again, but what was a promise worth? Not much, in her experience. How many times had her father promised never to slap her again? How many times had she heard him swear to her mother that he was going to give up drink forever? None of it meant anything. No, once they were gone, she might very well never see them again, and what would she be left with? A memory and a life in Chicken Town. "You can't do this to me," she told Mischief. "You can't leave me here, not knowing if you'll ever come back." As she spoke, she heard the jetty creak behind her. She looked around, already knowing what she would see. Mendelssohn's Shape was coming down the jetty toward them. For the first time she saw quite clearly why he limped, and perhaps why he hadn't been quite agile enough to catch hold of her. He was missing his right foot. It was severed at the ankle, and he walked on the stump as though it were a peg leg. If it gave him any pain, he didn't display it. He wore his arrowhead tooth grin as he approached his victims, spreading his arms like an old-style preacher welcoming them into his lethal flock. Candy knew that she still had a chance to escape, but she had no desire to turn back. Even if it meant risking life and limb to stay here on the jetty with Mischief, it was worth the risk. She grabbed a fierce hold of Mischief's hand and said, "Wherever you all go, I go." 8 faces looked at her wearing 8 different expressions. Philip looked perplexed, Sallow blinked, Moot feigned indifference, Drowse laughed, Pluckett sucked in his cheeks, Serpent scowled, and Slop blew out his lips in exasperation. Oh, and Mischief? He gave her a wide but unquestionably desperate smile. "You mean it?" he said. Shape was 30 yards from them, closing fast. "Yes, I mean it." "Then it seems we have no choice," he said. "We have to trust to the tide. Can you swim?" "Not very well." "Oh, Lordy-Loo," Mischief said, and this time all 8 faces did the same thing. They rolled their eyes. "I suppose not very well will have to do." "Then what are we waiting for?" Candy said. In the time it had taken them to have this short conversation, Shape had halved the distance between his claws and their throats. "Can we please go?" Drowse said, yelling louder than a head so small had any business yelling. Hand in hand, Candy and Mischief raced to the end of the jetty. "1," said Philip. "2," said Pluckett. "Jump!" said Slop. And together they leaped into the air, committing their lives to the frenzied waters of the Sea of Isabella. Part 2. Twilight and Beyond. From an anonymous source. Believe me when I say there are two powers that command the soul. One is God, the other is the tide. Chapter 10. The Waters. The Sea of Isabella was considerably colder than Candy had expected. It was gaspingly cold, ice to the marrow cold. But it was too late for her to change her mind now. With the ball knocked out of the cup by Mischief's bullet, the Sea of Isabella was retreating from the jetty at the same extraordinary speed at which it had first appeared, and it was carrying Candy and the John brothers along with it. The waters seemed to have a life of their own. Several times the sheer force of their energies threatened to pull her under, but Mischief had the trick of it. "Don't try to swim," he yelled to her over the roar of the retreating seas. "Just trust to Mama Isabella to take us where she wants to take us." Candy had little choice, she quickly realized. The sea was an irresistible power, so why not just lie back and enjoy the ride? She did so, and it worked like a charm. The moment Candy stopped flailing and trusted the sea not to harm her, the Isabella buoyed her up, the waves lifting her so high that on occasion she caught sight of the jetty and the lighthouse. They were already very far off, left behind in another world. She scanned the waters looking for Shape, but she couldn't see him. "You're looking for Mr. Shape?" said John Slop. He didn't need to yell any longer. Now that they were a good distance from the shore, the waves were no longer so noisy. "Yes, I was," Candy said, spitting out water every 5 or 6 words. "But I don't see him." "He has a glyph," Mischief said by way of explanation. "A glyph? What's a glyph?" "It's a craft, a flying machine. Well, actually it's words that turn into a flying machine." "She doesn't understand what you're saying, Mischief," John Sallow said. Sallow was right. Candy was completely confused by what Mischief was telling her. Words that turned into vehicles? Despite the look of incomprehension on her face, Mischief pressed on with his explanation. "The better you are at magic, the more quickly you can conjure a glyph. For the really expert magician, someone who knows his summonings, it can be almost instantaneous. 2 or 3 words and you've got a flying machine. But it will take Shape several minutes to conjure it. He's not a bright fellow. And if you get the conjuration wrong, it can be very messy." "Messy? Why?" "Because glyphs get you up in the air," Mischief said, pointing skyward. "But if they fail for some reason—" "You fall," said Candy. "You fall," Mischief said. "One of my sisters died in a decaying glyph." "Oh, I'm sorry," Candy said. "She was being abducted at the time," he said rather matter-of-factly. "That's terrible." "We later found out she'd arranged it all." "I don't understand. Arranged to be abducted?" "Yes, she was in love with this fellow, you see, who didn't love her. So she arranged to be abducted so that he would come after her and save her." "And did he?" "No." "So she died for love?" "It happens," said John Phillip. "And what of you, lady?" said John Drowse. "Do you have any sisters?" "No." "Brothers? Mother? Father?" "Yes, yes, and yes." "I don't see you mourning the fact that you may never see them again," John Serpent said rather sharply. "Be quiet, John," Mischief snapped. "She may as well hear the truth," John Serpent replied. "There's a very good chance she will never see her home again." Something about the expression on his face suggested to Candy that he was taking pleasure in attempting to scare her. "We're going to the Aberrat, girl," Serpent went on. "It's a very unpredictable place." "So's the hereafter," Candy said, not about to be intimidated by Serpent. "Nothing to compare," Serpent said. "A few tornadoes, a few poxes, inconsequential stuff. The Aberrat has terrors that will turn your hair white. That's even assuming we reach the islands." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Mama Isabella contains a wide variety of beasts that will have you as an appetizer." "Enough, Serpent," Mischief said. Does he mean sharks? Candy said, not wishing to exhibit too much nervousness, but already scanning the waters for a telltale dorsal fin. Sharks I'm not familiar with, Mischief replied, but the great green mantisac would certainly swallow us whole. We're not red, you see. Red? The creatures in the Isabella leave the color red alone. That's why all the ships and boats and ferries on the Sea of Isabella, every single one, are painted red. Candy was listening to this, but in truth she was only half hearing it. The flurry of events on the jetty hadn't given her time to properly think through the consequences of what she was doing. Now she had committed herself to the waters, and there was no way back. Perhaps she might never see her family again. What would it be like in the house when the family realized that she'd gone? They would surely assume the worst, think she'd been abducted or simply run away. It was her mother she was most concerned about because she'd take it the hardest. Hopefully there'd be some way to get a message to her when she reached their destination. "You're not regretting that you came, I hope," Mischief said, his expression suggesting he was feeling a little guilty for his own part in this. "No," Candy replied firmly. "Absolutely not." The words had no sooner escaped her lips than a big wave lifted her up and wrenched her away from the John brothers. In just a couple of seconds, she and Mischief were carried away from one another. She heard 3 or 4 of the brothers yelling to her, but she couldn't make sense of what they were saying. She caught sight of them in the dip between the waves, but the glimpse was brief. The next moment, they were gone. "I'm over here!" she yelled, hoping that Mischief was a stronger swimmer than she was and would be able to make his way back to her. But the words were no sooner out of her mouth than another wave of substantial size came along and carried her even farther away from the spot where they'd been parted. A little twitch of fear clutched her stomach. "Don't panic," she told herself. "Whatever you do, don't panic." But her own advice was hard to take. The waves were getting larger all the time, each one carrying her a little higher than the one that preceded it, and then delivering her into an even deeper trough. However much she told herself not to be afraid, there was no escaping from the facts. She was suddenly alone in an alien sea filled with all kinds of... Her panic stopped in its tracks, shocked out of her by a sight of such peculiarity all other concerns were forgotten. There, squatting around a small table at the bottom of the next wave, were 4 card players. The table around which they were sitting was apparently floating freely a couple of inches above the surface of the water, and the players were squatted around it, the very picture of nonchalance. Candy just had time to think, "I've seen everything now." Then another wave caught her, and she was carried down its steep blue slope into the midst of the game.
This ends Disc 2. Abarat, Disc 3.
Chapter 11. The Card Players. The 4 players were a mixture of species. Their skin was scaly and had a silvery green gleam to it, while their hands, in which they held fans of very battered playing cards, were webbed. Their faces, however, possessed all the features of a human face, but seasoned with a hint of fish. The game they were immersed in seemed to be demanding their full attention, because not one of the 4 noticed Candy until she came barreling down the flank of the wave and all but collided with their table. "Hey, watch out!" a female among the quartet complained. "And keep your distance. No spectators." 3 of the players were looking up at Candy now, while the 4th took the opportunity to take a surreptitious peek at the cards held by the players to his left and right. As soon as he'd done so, he concealed his cheating by feigning a great deal of interest in Candy. "You look lost," said the cheat, who was a male of this hybrid species. His accent seemed vaguely French. "Yes, I suppose I am," said Candy, spitting out water. "Actually, I suppose I'm very lost." "Helper de," the cheat casually said to the player on his left. "You're going to lose this game anyway." "How do you know?" It was the 4th player, a female, who offered up the answer. "Because you always lose, my dear," she said, patting his shoulder. "Now go and help the girl." De glanced at his hand of cards, and seeming to realize that he was indeed going to lose, tossed them down onto the table. "I don't see why we can't play water polo like everybody else," he complained with more than a hint of piscatorial pout. Then he drained the liquor glass that was sitting on the table in front of him and did something that defied all expectation. He got up from the table and, using his enormous feet, he skipped over the water to Candy, then squatted down again in the sea beside her. The smell of his breath was potent, and he seemed to have some difficulty fixing his focus on her. She was familiar with people in this condition, and it irritated her, but she was happier to have company in the water than to be alone. "I'm dead," the creature said. "Yes, I heard," Candy said. "I'm Candy Quackenbush." "You're from the hereafter, aren't you?" he said as they bobbed up and down together. "Yes, I am." "If you're thinking of going back, it's going to be a long trip." No, I don't want to go back," Candy said. "I'm headed for the Aberrat." "You are?" At the mention of the Aberrat, there was a show of interest from the rest of the table. 2 of the 3 other players threw in their hands, leaving the cheat protesting that this was unfair because he had the winning hand. "That's because you cheated, Pucks," one of the females said, and getting up in the same casual fashion as Duh, skipped over to Candy. Unlike her partner, she wasn't drunk. Indeed, she studied their human visitor with a curious intensity which put Candy in mind of the look Mischief had first given her. "Are you by any chance responsible for this occurrence?" "Which occurrence would that be?" Candy said. "You are, aren't you?" the female said. "I'm Tropella, by the way." "I'm very pleased." Yes, Tropella said impatiently. "You called the Isabella, didn't you?" Candy saw no reason not to tell the truth. "Yes," she admitted. "I called the sea. I didn't realize what I was doing when—" Again, rather rudely, she was cut off. Yes, but why? It is forbidden." "Oh, let the girl alone," Duh said. "No, but this is not to be taken lightly. The waters were never to go back to the hereafter. We all know that. So why—" "Look," said Candy, interrupting her questioner with the same curtness she'd received from Tropella. "Can we have this conversation later? I have a friend somewhere in the sea, and I've lost him." "Oh, lordy Lou," said Duh. "What's his name?" "Well, there are 8 of them. He has these brothers, and they live—" "On his head?" Duh said, leaning closer to Candy, his eyes wide. "Yes, you know him?" "That can only be John Mischief," Tropella said. "Yes, that's him." At the mention of John Mischief's presence hereabouts, the remaining card player abandoned their table and skipped over to Candy. She had all their attention now. "You know John Mischief?" Tropella said. "A little." "He's a master criminal," Pucks chimed in. "Wanted on several hours for grand larceny, and the Lord alone knows what else." "Really? He didn't seem like a criminal to me. In fact, he was very polite." "Oh, we don't care if he's a criminal," said Tropella. "The laws of the land aren't like the laws of the sea. We don't have courts and prisons." "We don't have a lot of thieves," Puck said, "because we don't have much to steal." "We're all sea skippers, by the way," Duh explained. "And you?" Tropella said, still studying Candy with that odd intensity of hers. "You were not wanted there, perhaps?" "I'm sorry?" "You weren't wanted in your world. Your business is in the Aberrat." Tropella didn't seem to require Candy to confirm or deny this. She was simply informing her of something she had already decided. "I wonder if we could do something about finding Mischief," Candy said, looking from face to face. "Duh," Puck said. "You have the largest voice." "Oh, my pleasure," said Duh. He clambered somewhat unsteadily onto the surface of the water and skipped up the side of the next large wave. Having reached the top, he stood there and hollered, confirming the fact that he did indeed have a voice of operatic proportions. "Mr. Mischief," he yelled, "we have your girlfriend, and we will eat her in 2 minutes with a small side salad unless you come here and save her." He grinned at Candy. "Just kidding," he said. "Well, Mr. Mischief," he yelled again, "where are you?" "He is joking?" Candy said to Pucks. "Oh, yes," said Pucks. "We wouldn't eat an important person like you. Sometimes we'll take a sailor, but," he shrugged, "so would you if it was always fish. Yellow fish, green fish, blue fish, fish with funny little eyes that go pop in your mouth. It gets so boring eating fish. So, yes, we eat a sailor now and then. But not you. You we will see safely to your destination. On that you may rely." Duh was still hollering, running up waves like a man running up a down escalator so as to stay at the top. "Hey, Mischief! We are very, very hungry!" "I think the joke's," Candy was about to say, "over," but she never finished the sentence. Before she could do so, John Mischief erupted out of the water behind Duh and grabbed him around the waist. Duh toppled backwards, and the two of them flailed wildly in the water for half a minute, the brothers hollering all manner of threats, until Pucks and Tropella were able to skip over and bring the altercation to a halt. "Hey, hey!" Duh said, climbing back onto the water to retreat from a furious Mischief. He held his webbed hands up, palms out, to keep his attacker at bay. "It was a joke, a little joke. I was just trying to get your attention. We mean your cutie pie no harm. I mean, what kind of fish folk do you think we are? Tell 'em, Candy." "They've all been very kind to me," Candy confirmed. "Nobody's laid a finger on me." The Johns were not convinced. They were all exchanging fiercely suspicious glances. "If it was a joke," John Drowse said fiercely, "then it was an extremely asinine joke." "I would have drowned without their help," Candy said, attempting to cool the situation down. "I swear I was starting to panic." "But you're right," Puck said. "It was an imbecilic, stupid joke. So, please, in the name of peace, let us carry you both to the Aberrat. The Isabella can be rough, and we wouldn't wish to see two such significant personages drown." "You would carry us?" said John Mischief, smiling his unruly smile. "Truly?" "Truly," said Tropella. "It's the least we can do." It certainly sounded like a good idea to Candy. Despite the fact that she had done as John Mischief had suggested and relied on Mama Isabella to bear her up, she was still extremely tired. The icy water and the pummeling of the waves, not to mention the pursuits that had preceded this aquatic adventure, had taken their toll. "What do you think?" Candy said to the Johns. "Should we accept the ride?" "I think it's up to you," Mischief said. "Good," Candy said. "Then I say yes." "Yes?" Puck said to Mischief. "If the lady says yes, then yes it is," Mischief replied. "Splendid," said the fourth card player. "I'm Kokono, by the way, and I just want to say what a delight it is to meet Mr. Mischief. Tropella was right. We don't care about the law of the land. So they say you're a criminal, so what? You're a master. That's what counts." The Johns erupted into a chaotic din of denials and explanations at Kokono's little speech. Candy only caught fragments of their defenses in the uproar, but they sounded distinctly contradictory. She was very amused. "Is it true?" she said, laughing, as the protestations grew wilder. "Are you all master criminals?" "Put it this way," John Slop began. "Be careful now," John Moot warned his brother. "We're not saints." "So it is true," Candy replied. Mischief nodded. "It's true," he conceded. "You're in the company of 8 world-class thieves," he said, not without a little touch of pride. "Saints we are not." "But then," said Duh, "who is?" He thought on this. "Besides saints." With this matter settled, Candy and Mischief were each lifted up between two of the sea skippers, their legs propped up on the creature skipping ahead of them and supported by those skipping behind. If it wasn't the most comfortable way to travel, it was certainly preferable to being immersed in the cold water in fear of drowning or being nibbled at by great green mantisacs. "Which island are you going to?" Pucks asked Candy. "I don't know," she replied. "This is my first visit." The sea skippers looked at the Johns for an answer. It was John Drowse who replied, "I say we go to the Yeba-Dim Day in the Straits of Dusk." There was a general consensus from the brothers. "The Yeba-Dim Day it is," Kokono announced. "Wait," Candy said. "Don't forget your table." "Oh, Mizza will find her own way home," Kokono said. "Mizza!" A head with large, rather woebegone features and a square cranium almost as flat as the shell on which the sea skipper's cards and liquor glass still stood appeared from the water. "You want me to wait for you at Tasmagor?" the creature said. "Yes, please," said Kokono. "It was nice playing on you," Dudu said, "as always." "Oh, think nothing of it," the card table replied, and paddled off through the swell. Candy shook her head. For some reason, out of the back of her skull came the memory of her beloved Uncle Fred, her mother's elder brother, who'd worked in a zoo in Chicago cleaning up after the animals. Once he'd been taking her around the place, pointing out his favorite animals, who were all oddities: the two-toed sloths, the anteaters, the mules. "If you ever doubted that God had a sense of humor, all you'd have to do is look at some of these guys," he'd remarked. Candy smiled to herself, picturing Uncle Fred's round, bald face as he looked fondly down at her. No doubt the sight of Mizza, the floating card table, would have had him laughing until the tears trickled down his face. "What are you smiling at, lady?" Mischief asked Candy. But before she had a chance to explain, the sea skippers took off at a breath-snatching speed, and they were on their way to the Yeba-Dim Day. Chapter 12. A Talk on the Tide. It was a bizarre journey for Candy. For John Mischief, too, she suspected. Even though the noise of the sea and the slap of the sea skipper's feet on the waters prevented them from conversing, Mischief and his brothers would occasionally erupt in laughter as though they were revisiting their recent adventures and were suddenly hugely amused by the fact that it was ending in this comfortable but faintly absurd fashion. For her part, Candy found the rhythm of the travel quite relaxing after a while, and was so lulled that she let her eyes close. Sleep quickly overtook her strangely fatigued body. When she opened her eyes an hour and 20 minutes later, according to her watch, the sky was darkening overhead. She was by habit a great sky watcher, and she knew the names of many of the stars and constellations. But though a sprinkling of stars had appeared as the darkness deepened, she found she could recognize none of the configurations ranged above her. At first she assumed she was simply looking at the sky from a different angle, and so was failing to recognize what was in fact a perfectly obvious constellation. But as she continued to study the heavens as they darkened to night, an unnatural night by Minnesotan standards, it was barely 2 in the afternoon, she realized that she was not mistaken. There were no recognizable arrangements of stars up there. This was not the same heaven that hung over Minnesota. For some reason she found this much more disquieting than the fact of the Sea of Isabella appearing from nowhere, or the prospect of some hitherto unvisited archipelago of islands awaiting her somewhere ahead. She had assumed, naively perhaps, that at least the stars would be constant. After all, hadn't the same star she knew by name hung over all the other fantastic worlds that had existed on Earth? Over Atlantis, over El Dorado, over Avalon? How could something so eternal, so immutable, be so altered? It distressed her, and, yes, it made her a little afraid of what lay ahead. Apparently the Abarat wasn't just another part of the planet she knew, simply hidden from the sight of ordinary eyes. It was a different world entirely. Perhaps it had different religions, different ideas about good and evil, about what was real and what wasn't. But it was too late to turn her back on all of this. After all, something here had called her, hadn't it? Wasn't that why she'd been drawing on her workbook the same design she'd found on the ball in the lighthouse? Because for some urgent reason the ball had been sending out a portion of its power, a power to summon seas, and her mind had been ready to receive it? She had done so without any conscious thought, drawn and redrawn the design in a dreamy state. She'd even walked away from the principal's office without giving what she was doing any deep thought, simply going where her feet and her instincts had led her. Though this all had looked accidental at the time, perhaps none of it was. Perhaps, as Tropella had said, Candy had business in the Aberrat. Was it possible? She was just a schoolgirl from Chickentown. What business could she have in a world she hadn't even seen? But then, was the idea any less likely than the fact that the sky over her head was now filled with stars from the heavens of another universe? Even the darkness between those stars, the darkness of space itself, was not like space as she saw it from her bedroom window. There were subtle colors pulsing through it, shades of deepest purple and rich royal blue moving like tides across the sky, ready to be swum or sailed. In the time that she had been turning all these wild ideas over, the Sea of Isabella had quieted down considerably. The waters were virtually flat now, and the step of the sea skippers more hushed because it was easier going. It was even possible for Candy and the Johns to chat normally as their bearers skipped side by side. "We're moving through the ring of darkness right now," John Drowse explained. "That light you see ahead of us?" Candy hadn't seen any light before, but now that it was pointed out, she saw a distinct paling of the sky close to the horizon. "The light at Efreet." "One of the unfettered islands," Sallow broke in to add. "What does that mean?" "It means they govern themselves," said John Slop. "They don't pay taxes to the aberration government, nor are they part of the Comexo Company." "Oh, don't get political on us, Slop," John Drowse complained. "I just wanted her to understand the complexities of—" "Nobody understands the complexities of the islands anymore," John Mischief said despairingly. "It used to be so simple. You had the islands of night and the islands of day. And almost constant war," John Serpent interjected. "At least everybody knew where they stood. You had your allegiances and you lived and died by them. But now," he made a noise of profound disgust, "now who knows?" "Oh, do stop," said John Drowse wearily. If there was more to be said on the subject, and undoubtedly there was, nobody got to say it, because at that moment Pucks whispered, "Quiet, everyone!" "What's the problem?" said Serpent. "Look up!" Everybody turned their gazes skyward. There were dark forms like those of huge birds with the bodies of men circling around, blotting out the stars. "Glitters," said Dudu. "They won't touch us," Sallow opined. "Maybe not," said Pucks. "But if they see us, they can report us to Inflixia Grewskin. We're in her waters." Candy didn't ask for the details on Inflixia Grewskin. The name was descriptive enough. "Are you going under the Gilhawley Bridge?" Mischief whispered. "It's the quickest way," said Tropella. "And we're all getting tired. Trust us. We know what we're doing." Mischief duly fell silent. By degrees, the travelers approached the bridge in question, which spanned perhaps half a mile's width of glacial water between two islands. On one side, the light was still embryonic, barely delineating the shapes of the cliffs and the immense buildings that were perched on top of them. On the other side, the light was noticeably brighter. Candy could see a temple of some kind, or perhaps the ruins of a temple, and beside it a row of pillars. One of the creatures Pucks had referred to as Vlitters swooped down and skimmed the shining water, its lower jaw cutting through the reflection of the starlit heavens. Candy caught only a glimpse as it dived, skimmed, and rose again. It was an odd-looking beast, a cross between a bat and a human being. Though it had failed to see the sea skippers and their passengers, the Vlitter did see something edible. It scooped up a fish the size of a baby, which let out a furious dog-like yelping as it was taken, and continued to yelp until the Vlitter consumed it, mercifully somewhere too high up to be seen. They moved on, with the yelping of the doomed dogfish still echoing off the walls of the temple and the cliffs, away from the calm waters beneath the bridge. The sea became steadily rougher as they cleared the protection of the islands, and Candy was glad, for all their sakes, that the journey's end was close at hand. What would she have done, she wondered, if she hadn't the good fortune to meet the card players at their game? She would surely have drowned, despite all that Mischief had told her about relying on the kind arms of Mama Isabella. They moved off to the left now, and what Candy saw ahead was yet another puzzlement. The sky, which had seemed to be growing lighter, was darkening once again. There was an immense bank of blue-gray mist filling the panorama ahead of them, and there were more stars showing through the mist. No doubt of it, the glimpse of day she'd seen had been only that, a glimpse. Now night was approaching again. The sight of this murky vista was clearly a welcome one for the sea skippers. Pucks was so happy he broke out into song as he skipped. The ditty was sung to the familiar tune of "O Christmas Tree," but the words were unexpected. "Oh, woe is me, oh, woe is me, I used to have a hamster tree, but it was eaten by a newt, and now I have no cuddly fruit. Oh, woe is me, oh, woe is me, I used to have a hamster tree." "You like my song?" Puck said when he was done. "It wasn't quite what I was expecting," Candy said, "but yes, it was certainly, unusual." "I'll teach it to you," Puck said. "Then you'll have something to sing as you go around the Yebba-Dim Day, and people will think, 'Oh, she's one of us.'" "Is this a very well-known song?" "Believe it or not," said John Serpent, his expression one of profound distaste, as usual. "Yes." "Then I should learn it," Candy said, secretly glad to be causing the condescending John Serpent a little discomfort. "So," said Mischief, "from the top, all together now." Everybody joined in with the song this time, except Serpent and Moot, and Candy quickly picked it up. By the time they came to the fourth rendition, Puck said, "This time a solo from Miss Quackenbush." "Oh, no." "Oh, yes," said Dödö. "We've carried you all this way. The least you can do is sing us a song." It was a reasonable request, so Candy sang out her first aberration song as the mist ahead began to thin and they skipped their way into the straits of dusk. "Nice, very nice," said Pucks when she was done. "Now I'll teach you another." "No, I think one's enough for now. Maybe another time." "I don't imagine there will be another time," said Tropella. "We very rarely come into the shipping routes. It's not safe. If we go to sleep on the waves, we risk getting mown down by a ferry. That's why we head back out to the Ring of Darkness. It's safer there." "Don't be so sure you won't meet this lady again," Mischief said to the company. "I believe she's in your lives forever now, and we're in hers. There are some people, you know, who are too important to ever be forgotten. I think she's one of them." Candy smiled. It was a sweet speech, even if she didn't quite believe it. Nobody seemed to know what to say when Mischief had finished, so there was just a thoughtful silence for a minute or two as the mists ahead of them continued to part. "Ah," said John Sallow, "I do believe I see the Yebba-Dim Day." The last scraps of mist parted now, and their destination came into view. It was not an island in any sense that Candy understood the word. It seemed to be a huge stone-and-metal head with towers built on top of its cranium, all filled with pinprick windows from which beams of light emerged to pierce the mist. "Set your watch to 8, Mischief said to Candy. "I don't understand," Candy said. "1 minute it looks like it's dawn, the next it's night, and now you're saying set my watch to 8 o'clock. "That's because we're now in the Straits of Dusk," said John Sallow, as though the matter were simplicity itself. "It's always 8 in the evening here." Candy looked well and truly confused. "Don't worry," said Dudu. "Eventually you'll get the knack of it. For now, just go with the flow. It's easier that way." While Candy set her watch to 8 o'clock, the sea skippers brought them around the front of the immense head of the Yebadim Day. A steep staircase ran like a vein up the side of the place, and more light poured from a host of windows and doors. There was a great riotous commotion coming out of the head, the din of voices shouting and singing and crying and laughing, all echoing across the water. "So, lady," said Dudu, "here we are." The sea skippers brought them to a tiny harbor in the nook where the Titan's chest met his arm. There were a number of small red boats in the harbor, many of which were in the process of entering or leaving, and a sizable crowd on the quayside. The entrance of the 4 sea skippers, along with their passengers, caused a good deal of confusion and comment. Very soon people were appearing from inside the great head to see what all the brouhaha was about. Among these newcomers were several people in uniforms. "Police!" said John Sallow sharply. The word was echoed among his brothers. "Police! Police! Police!" Mischief turned to Candy and swiftly caught hold of her arm. "So quickly," he said. "What do you mean? I have to go. So quickly. Because of the police?" "Keep your voice down," said John Serpent, his usual charmless self. "Hush," Mischief said to him. "Don't you ever talk to my lady that way again." "Your lady," Serpent snorted, as though in these final snatched moments he wanted to express his contempt for Mischief's respectful handling of Candy. But there was no time, not for Serpent nor for Mischief, not even for Candy to say more than a hurried "Goodbye." The police were coming down the dock, parting the crowd as they advanced. Candy doubted that they'd recognize the criminals yet, though Mischief's antlers made him exceptionally easy to spot, but they were interested in these new arrivals, and Mischief wasn't going to allow their general curiosity to turn into an arrest scene. "Do you have a permit for those sea skippers?" one of the policemen hollered. "This is where we part, lady," Mischief said. "We'll meet again, I know we will." He took her hand, turned it over, and lightly kissed the palm. Then he jumped into the water. "Hey, you!" a second policeman yelled, barging through the crowd to make his way to the end of the quayside. "It's him!" he yelled. "Oh, no," Candy heard Dudu say. "This is a pleasant introduction to the Yebadim Day." "We should have gone to Specklefru," said Tropella. "It would have been a sight quieter." "Well, it's too late now," said Pucks. "He's getting away!" the second policeman was shouting. "Who?" came the reply from one of his companions. "What's his name? The one who cleared out Malleus Nice's house in Tasmagor. Him! What's his face?" He was steadily becoming redder and redder as his frustration mounted. "The master criminal!" At which point about 7 people in the crowd said, "John Mischief," at the same time. "Yeah, that's what I said," the policeman replied lamely. "John Mischief." Now all eyes, both those of the crowd and of the officers, were fixed on the patch of turbulent water where John Mischief had last been seen. One of the policemen, a huge blue-skinned man with a square-cut orange beard, now attempted to commandeer one of the faster-looking boats in the little harbor, apparently intending to give chase in it. But its owner, who was almost as big as the officer and had the advantage of being 6 or 7 yards away across a span of grimy dock water, wasn't playing. "You! Get that boat over here!" the officer yelled. The man deliberately neglected to look in the officer's direction and proceeded to maneuver his vessel out through the knot of boats. Clearly, the idea of losing his precious boat to a belligerent officer with more testosterone than sea sense had made him nervous. The attempted retreat enraged the officer even more. "Come back!" he yelled. "Your vessel is commandeered!" "Let it be, Branks," one of the other officers called. "There are plenty of other boats." But Officer Branks wasn't going to have his authority disregarded. Pulling off his jacket and boots, he jumped into the dirty water and began to swim toward the retreating vessel, yelling as he went. "You bring that boat right back here! Do you hear me? Right back here!" His absurd behavior had trebled the crowd on the dock. The wooden structure was creaking, sending up a warning to those perched on it that it would not be wise to perch there much longer. The warning was, however, ignored, and the noisier the crowd became, the more people emerged from the great head to see what was going on. "You know, Candy," Tropella said, "I don't want another hurried goodbye, but if I'm going to go without being noticed, this would be a smart time to do it. Don't you agree?" "Absolutely," Candy said. Everybody's attention was on the swimming policeman who had managed to reach the escapee in the boat and had hauled himself on board where, despite cries from his fellow officers that he should desist, he proceeded to harangue the boat owner, who promptly hit the policeman with an oar. The oar broke, and Officer Branks toppled over the edge of the boat like a silent comedian, sinking into the filthy water. Consternation! Now it was the boat owner who dived in to drag the unconscious man up out of the water, mindful, no doubt, of what the penalty would be if the overzealous officer drowned. The dousing had shocked Policeman Branks out of his unconscious state, however, and as soon as he surfaced, the altercation began afresh. The two men struggled and flailed in the water for a while, during which time Candy, having exchanged the very briefest of farewells with the sea skippers, slipped away through the crowd toward the door of the Yebadim Day. As she went, she glanced over her shoulder so as to have one last glimpse of her friends to fix in her head, just in case Mischief was overly optimistic in his beliefs and none of them ever met again. But Mischief had long gone, and all four skippers had already leaped into the water and dived down under the boats so as to escape the harbor undetected. Candy experienced a sudden and acute sense of loss. She felt utterly and painfully alone. Without John Mischief, how would she get by in this strange world? It wasn't that she felt the need to turn around and go home. There was nothing for her back in Chicken Town, or at least nothing that she wanted. She hated her father, and her mother, well, she just made her feel empty. No, there was nothing for her there. But coming here, entering this strange new world, was like being born again. A new life under new stars. So it was with a curious mingling of anticipation and heavy heart that she pressed against the flow of the crowd and eventually brought herself through the doors and into the city that stood on the Straits of Dusk. Chapter 13. In the Great Head. Candy had always prided herself upon having a vivid imagination. When, for instance, she privately compared her dreams with those her brothers described over the breakfast table or her friends at school exchanged at break, she always discovered her own night visions were a lot wilder and weirder than anybody else's. But there was nothing she could remember dreaming by day or night that came close to the sight that greeted her in the great head of the Yebadim Day. It was a city built from the litter of the sea. The street beneath her feet was made from timbers that had clearly been in the water for a long time, and the walls were lined with barnacle-encrusted stone. There were 3 columns supporting the roof made of coral fragments cemented together. They were buzzing hives of life unto themselves, their elaborately constructed walls pierced with dozens of windows from which light poured. There were 3 main streets that wound up and around these coral hives, and they were all lined with habitations and thronged with the Yebadim Day's citizens. As far as Candy could see, there were plenty of people who resembled folks she might have expected to see on the streets of Chicken Town, give or take a sartorial detail, a hat, a coat, a wooden snout. But for every one person that looked perfectly human, there were 2 who looked perfectly other than human. The children of 1,000 marriages between humankind and the great bestiary of the Abarat were abroad in the streets of the city. Among those who passed her as she ventured up the street were creatures which seemed related to fish, to birds, to cats and dogs and lions and toads, and those were just the species she recognized. There were many more she did not, forms of face that her dream life had never come near to showing her. Though she was cold, she didn't care. Though she was weary to her marrow and lost, oh, so very lost, she didn't care. This was a new world rising before her, and it was filled with every kind of diversity. A beautiful woman walked by, wearing a hat like an aquarium. In it was a large fish whose poignant expression bore an uncanny resemblance to the woman on whose head it was balanced. A man half Candy's size ran by, with a second man half the first fellow's size sitting in the hood of his robe, throwing nuts into the air. A creature with red ladders for legs was stalking its way through the crowd farther up the street, its enormous coxcomb bright orange. A cloud of blue smoke blew by, and as it passed, a foggy face appeared in the cloud and smiled at Candy before the wind dispersed it. Everywhere she looked, there was something to amaze. Besides the citizens, there were countless animals in the city, wild and domesticated. White-faced monkeys like troops of clowns were on the roofs baring their scarlet bottoms to passers-by. Beasts the size of chinchillas but resembling golden lions ran back and forth along the power cables looped between the houses, while a snake, pure white but for its turquoise eyes, wove cunningly between the feet of the crowd, chattering like an excited parrot. To her left, a thing that might have had a lobster for a mother and Picasso for a father was clinging to a wall, drawing a flattering self-portrait on the white plaster with a stick of charcoal. To her right, a man with a firebrand was trying to persuade a cow with an infestation of yellow grasshoppers leaping over its body to get out of his house. The grasshoppers weren't the only insects in the city. Far from it. The air was filled with buzzing life. High overhead, birds dined on clouds of mites that blazed like pinpricks of fire. Butterflies the size of Candy's hand moved just above the heads of the crowd, and now and then alighted on a favored head as though it were a flower. Some were transparent, their veins running with brilliant blue blood. Others were fleshy and fat. These, the preferred food of a creature that was as decadently designed as a peacock, its body vestigial, its tail vast, painted with colors for which Candy had no name. And on all sides, among these astonishments, were things that were absurdly recognizable. Televisions were on in many of the houses, their screens visible through undraped windows. A cartoon boy was tap-dancing on one screen, singing some sentimental song on another, and on a third a number of wrestlers fought. Humans matched with enormous striped insects that looked thoroughly bored with the proceedings. There was much else that Candy recognized. The smell of burned meat and spilled beer. The sound of boys fighting. Laughter like any other laughter. Tears like any other tears. To her amazement, she heard English spoken everywhere, though there were dozens of dialects, and of course the mouthparts that delivered the words also went some way to shape the nature of the English that was being spoken. Some of it was high and nasal, a sing-song variation that almost seemed about to become music. From other directions came a guttural version that descended at times into growls and yappings. All this, and she had advanced perhaps 50 yards into the Yebadim day. The houses at the lower end of the great head, where she was presently walking, were all red, their fronts bowed. She quickly grasped why. They were made of boats, or the remains of boats. To judge by the nets that were hung as makeshift doors, the occupants of these houses were the families of fishermen who'd settled here. They'd dragged their vessels out of the cool evening air and taken a hammer and crowbar to the cabins and the deck and hold, peeling apart the boards so as to make some kind of habitation on land. There was no order to any of this. People just seemed to take whatever space was available. How else to explain the chaotic arrangement of vessels, one on top of the other? As for power, it seemed to be nakedly stolen from those higher up in the city, and therefore presumably more wealthy. Cables ran down the walls, entering houses and exiting again to provide service for the next house. It was not a foolproof system by any means. At any one moment, looking up at the hundreds, perhaps thousands of heaped-up houses, somebody's lights were flickering, or there was an argument going on about the cables. No doubt the presence of monkeys and birds pecking at the cables or simply swinging from them did not improve matters. It was a wonder, Candy thought, that this outlandish collection of people, animals, and habitations worked at all. She couldn't imagine the people of Chickentown putting up with such chaotic diversity. What would they think of the ladder-legged creature, or the smoke creature, or the baby beast throwing nuts in the air? I need to remember as many details as I can so when I get back home I can tell everybody what it was like, down to the last brick, the last butterfly. I wonder, she thought to herself, if they make cameras here. If they have televisions, she reasoned, then surely they have cameras. Of course, she'd first have to find out if the few soaked and screwed-up dollars she had in the bottom of her pocket were worth anything here. If they were, and she could find somewhere to purchase a camera, then she could make a proper record of what she was seeing. Then she'd have proof, absolute proof, that this place, with all its wonders, existed. "Are you cold?" The woman who had addressed her looked as though she might have some sea skipper in her heritage. Vestigial gills ran from the lower half of her cheek into her neck, and there was a faintly mottled quality to her skin. Her eyes had a subtle cast of silver about them. "Actually, I am a little," Candy said. "Come with me. I'm Izarith." "I'm Candy Quackenbush. I'm new here." "Yes, I could tell," Izarith said. "It's cold today. The water gets up through the stones. One day this place is just going to rot and collapse on itself." "That would be a pity," Candy said. "You don't live here," Izarith said with a trace of bitterness. She led Candy to one of the houses made from fishing boats. As she followed the woman to the threshold, Candy felt just a little pang of doubt. Why was she being invited into Izarith's house so quickly without any real reason beyond that of a stranger's generosity? Izarith seemed to sense her unease. "Don't come in if you don't want to," she said. "I just thought you looked in need of a fire to warm you through." Before Candy could reply, there was a series of crashes from outside the head, accompanied by a din of yells and screams. "The dock!" Candy said, looking back toward the door. Obviously, the jetty had finally given out beneath the weight of the crowd. There was a great rush of people out to see the calamity, which was, of course, only going to make matters worse out there. Izarith showed no desire to go and see what had happened. She just said, "Are you coming?" "Yes," said Candy, offering the woman a smile of thanks and following her inside. Just as Izarith had promised, there was a fire in the little hearth, which the woman fueled with a handful of what looked like dried seaweed. The kindling was consumed quickly and brightly. A soothing wave of warmth hit Candy. "Oh, that's nice," she said, warming her hands. On the floor in front of the fire was a child of perhaps 2, her features one generation further removed from the sea-dwelling origins of her grandparents, or perhaps her great-great-grandparents. "This is Mesa. Mesa, this is Candy. Say hello." "Hell-oh," said Mesa. With her duty to courtesy done, Mesa returned to playing with her toys, which were little more than painted blocks of wood. One of them was a boat painted red, a crude copy, perhaps, of the vessel whose boards had built these walls. Izarith went to check on the other child in the room, a baby asleep in a cot. "That's Nazray," she said. "She's been 6 since we came here. He was born at sea, and I believe he wants to go back there." She bent low, talking softly to the baby. "That's what you want, isn't it, dearling? You want to be out away from here." "You want that too?" Candy said. "With all my heart. I hate this place." "Can't you leave?" Izarith shook her head. "My husband Rufus had a boat, and we used to fish around the outer islands where the shoals are still good. But the boat was getting old, so we came here to trade it in for a new one. We had some money from the season's fishing, and we thought we'd be able to get a good boat, but there were no new boats to be had. Nobody's building anymore, and now we're almost out of money. So my husband's working putting in toilets for folks in the towers, and I'm stuck down here with the children." As she told her tale, she pulled back a makeshift curtain which divided the little room in two, and, sorting through a box of garments, she selected a simple dress which she gave to Candy. "Here," she said, "put this on. If you wear those wet clothes much longer, you'll get phlegmatic." Gratefully, Candy put it on, feeling secretly ashamed of her initial suspicion. Isarith obviously had a good heart. She had very little to share, but what she had, she was offering. "It suits you," Isarith said, as Candy tied a simple rope belt around her waist. The fabric of the dress was brown, but it had a subtle iridescence to it, a hint of blue and silver in its weave. "What's the currency here?" Candy asked. Plainly, Isarith was surprised by the question, understandably so, but she answered anyway. "It's a zem," she said, "or a paterzem, which is 100 zem note." "Oh, why do you ask this question?" Candy dug in the pocket of her jeans. "It's just that I have some dollars," she said. "You have dollars?" Isarith replied, her mouth wide in astonishment. "Yes, a few." Candy pulled the sodden notes out and carefully spread them on the hearth where they steamed in front of the fire. Isarith's eyes didn't leave the bills from the moment they appeared. It was almost as though she was witnessing a miracle. "Where did you get those?" she said, her voice breathless with astonishment. Finally, she tore her gaze from the hearth and looked up at Candy. "Wait," she said. "Is it possible?" "Is what possible?" "Do you come from the hereafter?" Candy nodded. "Actually, I come from a place called America." "America!" Isarith spoke the word like a prayer. "You have dollars, and you come from America!" She shook her head in disbelief. Candy went down on her haunches before the fire and peeled the now almost dried dollars off the hearth. "Here," she said, offering them to Isarith. "You have them." Isarith shook her head, her expression one of almost religious awe. No, I couldn't. Not dollars. Angels use dollars, not schismet like me." "Take it from me," Candy said. "I'm not an angel. Very far from it. And what's a schismet?" "My people are schismet, or they were, generations ago. The bloodline's been diluted over the years. You have to go back to my great-grandfather for a pure schismet." She looked melancholy, an expression which suited the form of her face better than any other. "Why so sad?" "I just wish I could go back into the deeps and make my home there, away from all this." Isarith cast her sad eyes toward the window, which was without frames or panes. The crowd outside moved like a relentless parade. Candy could see how hard it would be to exist in this tiny hovel with the twilight throng moving up and down the street outside, all the hours that God sent. "When you say the deeps," Candy replied, "do you mean the sea?" "Yes, Mama Isabella. The schismet had cities down there, deep in the ocean, beautiful cities made of white stone." "Have you ever seen them?" "No, of course not. After 2 generations you lose the way of the fish. I would drown like you." "So what can you do?" "Live on a boat as close as we can to the deeps. Live with the rhythm of Mother Isabella beneath us." "Well, perhaps the dollars will help you and Rufus to buy a boat," Candy said. Candy handed Isarith a 10 and 1 single, keeping 6 for herself. Isarith laughed out loud, the music in her laughter so infectious that her daughter Mesa started laughing too. $11? 11! It would buy 2 boats, 3 boats. It's like 11 paterzem. More, I think. She looked up, suddenly anxious. "And this is really for me?" she said, as though she was afraid the gift would be reclaimed. "It's all yours," Candy said, feeling a little odd about sounding too magnanimous. After all, it was only $11. "I'm going to spend a little piece of this one," Isarith said, selecting a single and pocketing the rest. "I'm going to buy some food. The children haven't eaten this day. I think you haven't either." Her eyes were shining, their joy increased by the silvery luster that was the gift of her schismate breeding. "Will you stay with them while I go out?" she said. "Of course," Candy said. She suddenly realized she was starving. "And Mesa?" "Yes, Mama?" "Will you be kind to the lady from the hereafter while I fetch bread and milk?" "Grish fritters," said Mesa. "Is that what you want? Grish fritters with noga seeds?" "Grish fritter with noga seeds! Grish fritter with noga seeds!" "I won't be long," Isarith said. "We'll be fine," Candy said, sitting down beside the child in front of the fire. "Won't we, Mesa?" The child smiled again, her tiny teeth semi-translucent, carrying a hint of blue. "Grish fritters with noga seeds," she said. "All for me!" Chapter 14. Carrion. Over his many years of service to Christopher Carrion, Mendelssohn Shape had come to know the geography of the 12th tower on the island of Gorgosium very well. He knew his way around the kitchens and the scrying rooms. He knew his way down through the vaults and the Black Chapel and through the rooms of tears. But today, when he returned to the tower with the news that he had lost everything, the key, mischief, and his accomplice in his theft, the girl called Candy, Shape was told by Carrion's lumpen-headed servant Gnaw that he was to report to a chamber he had never visited before, the great library close to the top of the tower. Dutifully, he did so. It was the largest room he had ever entered in his life, a vast, round, windowless chamber with stacks of books rising perhaps 40 feet into the air. Waiting there for his master to arrive, Mendelssohn was not a happy man. He was dressed in a long, shabby coat that was lined with werewolf baby wool, but it didn't keep the cold from his marrow. His teeth wanted to chatter, but he kept them from doing so. It would not be good to show fear, he knew. Carrion would only be inspired to cruelty if he sensed that the creature he was talking to was afraid. Mendelssohn had witnessed Carrion's cruelties many times. Sometimes he'd come to this tower and it seemed there'd be somebody weeping or screaming or begging for mercy behind every door. All Carrion's handiwork. Even today, climbing the stairs to the great library, he'd heard somebody behind the stones, sealed in forever in some dark, narrow space in the walls, calling out to him, sobbing for light, a piece of bread, mercy. But this was the wrong place to look for mercy, Mendelssohn knew. The vaulted ceilings of the 12th tower, which were painted with scenes designed to terrify, had looked down on many a dreadful scene, and none had ended, Mendelssohn was certain, with the granting of mercy. His footless leg was aching, but he didn't dare sit down in case Carrion entered and caught him lounging. Instead, to pass the time, he went to one of the many tables in the library stacked with books that had presumably been brought down from the shelves because they had caught Carrion's eye. One, set on a little lectern for easy reading, was a book Shape remembered from his childhood. Pincoffin's Rhymes and Nonsenses. The book had been a favorite of his, containing many a rhyme and lullaby he still knew by heart, including the one he'd sung to the girl from the hereafter. It was open to a grim little nursery song he had forgotten, but now, reading it, he was enchanted anew. Scare baby, where do you run? Out in the graveyard to have you some fun. Dancing with skeletons up from the ground, doing a jig on the burial mound. His lips moved as he scanned the words, and it brought back a distant memory of his mother, Miasma Shape, sitting with her 3 boys, Niz, Knott, and Mendelssohn, reading aloud from Pincoffin's opus. Oh, how he'd idolized his mother. He read on. Scare baby, horrid you are, with the wings of a bat and a face with a scar, the fangs of a vampire, the tail of a snake. You open your mouth and the noise that you make is a song that the devil sings, bitter and loud. Tell me, my baby, was your mother proud? A song that the devil sings. That was a phrase that had lingered in his head over the years, though he had forgotten, until now, its source. He had many times wondered if he could ever hope to make such a song. He let a sound escape his throat now, a low, menacing growl that was magnified by the circular chamber. Oh, yes, that sounded like something to put fear in the hearts of his enemies. That was the noise, he thought to himself, that he would make when he found that wretched girl again, a sound so horrible her wits would crumble. He made a louder noise still, and from the top of the stacks of books, disturbed by the din, there swooped two winged creatures that descended to a point about 3 feet over his head, and there hovered. They were the size of vultures, and they had ashen, bloated faces like monstrous cherubs. "What do you want?" he said, staring up at them. Their tiny, whiteless eyes fixed on him for a moment, then they seemed to decide that he was nothing of importance and returned to their roosts, climbing in wide spirals to the top of the stacks. Mendelssohn returned to the final verse of the poem. Scare baby, where do you run? Not out to the morning, not out in the sun. You live in my nightmares, you hide from the day, and their little shape. The one-footed man turned. The voice had come out of the shadows across the room. No door had opened to let the speaker in. He'd been here all the time, watching Mendelssohn, listening to him practice his growls. Mendelssohn didn't move. He simply studied the shadows, waiting for the appearance of the person who had addressed him. He knew, of course, who that somebody was. It was the Lord of Midnight himself, Christopher Carrion. "Sit," the voice said. "Please, Shape, sit. Are you fond of books?" The voice was deep and, even in the simplest of questions, was somehow tinged with despair. It was the voice of someone who had walked in the abyss. Mendelssohn could see him now faintly. He was an imposing figure, 6'6" or more, his long robes black, which was why he had blended so well with the shadows. He walked toward Shape, and the candles on the table illuminated him a little. He had the most piercing eyes of any man Mendelssohn had met. They glistened in his bald, pale head. As always, he wore a collar of translucent material that resembled glass, which had been devised to cover the lower half of his head. It was filled with a blue fluid, which was now suddenly lit up by the presence of several snaking forms. They flickered in their fluid, some white as summer lightning, some yellow as sliced fat, weaving bright patterns around the Lord of Midnight's head. Plainly, he took pleasure in their proximity, perhaps even a kind of comfort. When one of them brushed against his skin, he smiled, and that smile was so ghastly it made Mendelssohn want to run from the room. He knew from what Gnaw had told him why Carrion smiled that smile and what those bright shapes were. Carrion had found a way to channel every nightmarish thought and image out of the coils of his brain and bring them into this semi-physical form. He breathed the fluid. The flickering forms ran in and out of his mouth and nostrils, soaking his soul in his own nightmares. His voice, reverberating through this soup of dark visions, was tinged with the power of those nightmares. Their terror touched every syllable he spoke. "The books, Shape." "Yes, the books. I have books. A few." "And what else do you have?" Carrion said. The serpentine lights flickered around Midnight's head, his eyes fixed on Mendelssohn. "Or don't have? You mean the key?" "Yes, of course. The key. What else would I mean?" "Lord, please forgive me. I don't have the key." Mendelssohn waited, fearing that Carrion would come at him, strike him perhaps, but no, he just stood there, piercing Shape with his hollow gaze. "Go on," he said quietly. I found the men who stole it from you. John Mischief and his brothers." "Yes." "He escaped with the key to Efreet and took a boat to the hereafter. I went after him, and I sank the boat and thought I would have him. But the tide was with him. It carried him all the way to the other side." "All the way to the hereafter?" Carrion said, with a little touch of yearning in his voice. "Yes." "How is it there?" he said, almost conversationally. "I saw very little of it. I was trying to catch Mischief." "Of course you were. You were doing your honest best, but he kept avoiding you. 8 heads are better than 1, eh? You were outnumbered." "I was, Lord," Mendelssohn said, beginning to dare to think that his master understood the hazards his servant Shape had endured to get all the way to the hereafter and back. Carrion went to the largest of the chairs in the chamber. He sat down in it and knitted his hands together lightly in front of him as if in prayer. "So," he said. "So? Tell me what happened." "Oh, well, I almost caught up with him at Hawk's Harbor." "The harbor? I thought it was destroyed." "There are some minor portions remaining, Lord. A lighthouse, a jetty." "No ships?" "No ships. I think those that were scuttled are buried in the earth. Anyway, I saw none." "So, go on. You went to the harbor, and he had an accomplice." "Besides his brothers?" "Yes, a girl from the hereafter." "Ah, he had an accomplice, and a girl to boot. Poor Shape, you didn't stand a chance." "No, Lord." "So he gave her the key?" "Did he? I don't know. Yes, possibly." "Did he or did he not give her the key?" Carrion asked, his voice subtly gaining in volume and menace. Mendelssohn looked at the floor. His teeth had begun to chatter, though he'd promised himself he wouldn't let them. "Look at me, Shape!" Mendelssohn was afraid to do so. He kept his eyes downcast like a man confronted by an enraged animal. "I said, look at me!" Shape seemed to feel something catch hold of his head and jerk it back so that he was forced to look at the man sitting before him. An instant later, that same power pressed on his shoulders, driving him down onto the mosaic floor with such force that his knee bones cracked like whips. Carrion's face looked skeletal, the marks around his mouth, where, according to rumor, his grandmother Mater Motley had once sewn up his lips, like the teeth of a skull. The arid flesh above the line of the fluid close to mummified. Only his eyes had any real life, and that was an insane life, crazed beyond recall. There was nothing in the world Mendelssohn Shape wanted more than to be out of the library at that moment. "You've failed me," Carrion said. His voice seemed to resonate in Mendelssohn's head, so that Shape was suddenly and sickeningly aware of the form of his own skull, of the death's head he carried just out of sight behind his skin. "I'm sorry. I did all I could, I swear." "What was the name of this girl?" "I heard only one name. Candy." Carrion's upper lip curled at the very idea of sweetness. "Would you know her again if you saw her?" "Yes, of course." "Then it seems I must let you live, Mendelssohn." You have dealt with this girl. Presumably you know something of her nature. Yes, I believe I do, Shape said through his chattering teeth. He wanted desperately to look away from Carrion's face, but the Lord of Midnight held him there. I think she probably has the key, don't you? But Mischief gave it to her. I didn't see such a thing, Lord, but he will have done so. If I may ask, what makes you so sure? Because he's like you. He's tired of the chase. He wants somebody else to be the object of my eye, at least for a while. Carrion paused for a moment and looked up at the ceiling. The cherubic beasts, roused from their roosts by the sound of the torment below, were circling in the library vault, enjoying the spectacle. Finally, Carrion said, "You have to go back and find me this girl." "But, Lord..." "Yes?" "She came here." Carrion rose from his seat. "You saw her here?" "No, I saw the tide carry her away." "So she could have drowned. She could be in the belly of a mantisack." He came at Mendelsohn finally, his hands raised. Filled with a kind of terrible relief that he was getting what he deserved, Shape felt himself lifted up, though Carrion made no contact with him. He was thrown across the nearest table, and the books, including Pincoffin's rhymes, went flying. Mendelsohn was held down by an invisible force so strong it kept his breath from coming freely. He heard his breastbone creak. "Listen to me, Shape," Carrion said. "Your brothers are dead for their failures, and you will join them in the lime pit if you do not succeed in this last venture. Do you understand?" Mendelsohn could barely manage a nod. "Find me this Candy. If she's dead, find me her body. I can interrogate the dead if I need to. I want to know what kind of creature she is. The tide carried her, you say?" "It seemed that way," Mendelsohn said. "That's strange. After all that happened, I'm sure Our Lady Isabella would drown most souls rather than carry them here." Carrion took his eyes off Shape for the first time in several minutes, and Shape felt the weight of the power upon him relax somewhat. "There is something strange here," Carrion said, half to himself. "Something mysterious." "How will I find her, Lord, in all the islands?" "You will have help for that," Carrion said, his wrath apparently quenched. "Go down to the kitchens, eat, wait for word from Gnaw. I will see you again when I have some clue." "Yes, Lord." "A girl, eh?" Carrion said, as though amused at the notion. Then he moved away and was enveloped by the darkness. The bone-cracking weight removed from his chest, Shape rolled off the table, gasping for breath. In the vaulted ceiling above, the vile cherubs were still circling, chattering to one another as they went, excited by the violence they'd just witnessed. Mendelsohn ignored them. He hauled himself up to his foot and stump, and waited a few moments until the ache in his chest subsided. Then he hobbled to the door and headed away down to the kitchens, promising to himself he would burn his few books when he went home, for fear they would put him in mind of the terrors he had just endured.
This ends Disc 3.